A tall, handsome young man stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom. In life, he knew what he looked like, what kind of hair he had. But in the reflection on one side there was him, but on the other there was a completely different guy with black hair. Both were confused, not understanding how this happened. The blonde's name is Darren, and the brunette's name is Max. The first one looked at his characteristics. He was the heir of a great clan with a demon hunter class. Later, he decided to leave the reflection alone and went to make himself some tea. The young man thought about the past and compared all the facts. His inner self. Max realized that he had become the character he had created 12 years ago in his second year of high school. He recalled drawing Darren and coming up with all sorts of characteristics for him as a child. He would be obsessed with the idea of creating another noble version of himself. Then, the guy was under the influence of the 8th grade syndrome. He was too impressed by a game called History of the Continent of Arcana, one of the best virtual reality games about another world. It did not lose popularity until its closure, which made it a legendary game. But on the day of the closure, along with the news of the disappearance of the CEO of the company, Cosmo, Arcana became a part of reality. Monsters began to appear from rifts all over the world, and the existence of humanity was under threat. But along with the monsters came people who were in sync with their characters. They were called players, and they could use skills to defeat monsters and save the world. There were times when Max wanted to become one of them, but even then he realized that even with the awakening of the Force, he would not be as popular. The price of one virtual reality machine is tens of millions of won. Even a month's rent would cost hundreds of thousands. His father's business failed, and he blamed himself for being a bad father and not being able to provide his son with even computer games. His sister tried to calm him down, but his mother said it was all her fault. Then the young man realized the cruelty of the world around him. He had no choice but to throw the lasso. If he knew that this would happen, he would never have quit. Having lost for less than a year, his characteristics and level were very low. He was finally able to awaken, but into a damn character that a crazy schoolboy made. The character's name was Darren, and the guy played it with all seriousness. The backstory is this. The young man was the heir to a great family, but all the relatives fell victim to the demon, so only he remained. Darren decided to become a demon hunter to get revenge. A very creepy character, whom Max seriously considered his second personality. It was funny in his second year of high school, but now it's an endless source of shame for him. On top of that, this hero speaks very strangely, like an aristocrat, which Max doesn't like at all. The guy was worried about his appearance and manner of speech, because of which he could not calmly appear in society and become its full-fledged member. He imagined his boss at work scolding him for his appearance. And knowing Darren's manners and character, he will not tolerate this and will definitely do something terrible. He couldn't go to work because he could be sued for indecent acts. Max's thoughts were transformed into Darren's words in a completely different way. He said that nobles do not bow their heads to everyone. Brunette was concerned about whether all players felt the same when synchronizing. Although most said that the changes were minimal, he understood that if he couldn't go to work, he would have to become a player. But more than 10 years had passed, and he remembered almost nothing about Arcana. He decided to search for information first because he lacked even basic knowledge of the player. Rankers who close high-level rifts earn hundreds of millions, but this information is of little use because difficulty is directly related to risk. The main thing now is to figure out what the demon hunters usually do, but the site only had 2 pages and no useful news at all. Suddenly the hero stumbles upon terrible news. It said that all the NPC demon hunters in Akshan City had been killed. The only city and sacred land of the demon hunters was destroyed. Max realized that there was so little information not because they were doing nothing, but because the class had completely disappeared. Although no one chose them 10 years ago, low characteristics, strange pumping, and disgusting skills. This class has a hard time leveling up by hunting monsters, so it had to be leveled up through quests. The only thing they were incomparably better at than other classes was fighting demons, but they only appeared in demon hunting quests. Most of them were just grinding. The role of the hunter was unclear. But being bankrupt and not being able to change jobs are 2 different things. Now there's no one to even teach skills, since everyone has been killed. However, one piece of news caught the guy's eye. It said that the update introduced demons that only hunters could best deal with. Now there are demons among the monsters. Player losses have increased greatly due to debuffs, possession, destruction of the mind, problems even for rankers with level 200. It turns out that demons appeared in reality, and since the hunters did not deal with them, this means that after the destruction of Akshan, the young man became the last demon hunter. He was wondering whether he should return after a 10-year hiatus. There is no guarantee that the demons he remembers will appear, A lot could have changed during this time. If even high-level players can't handle it, then Max even more so. Little Max reminded that the great Darren does not run away from pathetic demons. No temptations and trials will touch his great pride. Darren knew that these were useless thoughts and there was no reason to worry. Meanwhile, the news was reporting on the dire consequences of the demon update. The blonde said out loud that he would personally send each of them to hell. Several years have passed since the Great Cataclysm. Many things were lost, but people were able to get back on their feet. The streets are alive again and everyone has adapted to the new world, but there is always darkness next to the light. The negative emotions of people who have gathered together again have become excellent food for demons. One ordinary day, a young man named Greg, the leader of the group, was standing on the street, waiting for the last member along with the others. Just a few moments later, Darren joined them. The friendly leader introduced the new team member to everyone and greeted the cold blonde himself. The young man, whose attention had been drawn to the rift, now understood how the players saw him. Normal people cannot interact with the rift in any way. Darren was level 55, which was perfectly within the recommended 35-40 for completing the game. When he searched for information, he learned that the average level of rift attackers was 200, so it would take a lot of work to reach such heights. Luckily, not everyone awakens as a high-level player, so he was able to find a suitable group. The participants appeared before him: the quiet brunette, Bob, the cute sorceress, Catherine, and the melee attacker, Kevin. The group leader announced that after 5 minutes of a little preparation they would enter, because judging by the destruction, the other group was already inside. The destruction rate was 19.8%. When it reaches 100%, monsters break through the rift into the real world, and players can freely enter and protect them. Only they can stop this time bomb. Max wanted to say something encouraging, but Darren said that with him, the guys don't have to worry about anything and was cruelly ignored. The participants chatted about the battle and paid no attention to him. Meanwhile, the players entered the Knoll's underground storage facility, the food warehouse. Catherine was surprised that there weren't any monsters around, but Greg reassured her that another group had passed through before them, so they just needed to take a slightly different route. Darren sensed that something was wrong, so he walked behind. The commander saw the Knolls appearing unexpectedly and ordered to prepare for battle. The blonde analyzed a very common combination of group members and realized that the tank, Bob, does not protect the group, but attracts even more monsters. The attacking tank had to go completely into defense, and the mage deals the main damage. Being useless, the player decided to check the inventory, which did not contain any good weapons, so it was better for him not to get involved in the fight. However, suddenly an enemy arrow flew at Darren from the side. It turned out that there was an ambush behind the pillars, which instantly attacked the team. An even more fierce battle began, and the group was barely able to cope. It was at this moment that Greg, the leader, decided to leave the fight and disappeared. Kevin, seeing this, became distracted by him and began to angrily shout at him to come back. Suddenly, the guy is attacked by a monster and the blade approaches his eye. But Darren shoots his bow in time, saving his comrade's life. Bob fought desperately with a bunch of creatures, but he was unable to stop them all. Catherine panicked, but a blonde man came up to her and told her to calm down, because he would deal with the breakthrough, and she would need to use a strong spell. After some time, the girl was ready to attack and warned the team. Fiery arrows began to fly out and pierce everything in their path. This attack helped to defeat the enemies, and the guys began to slowly look around. Furious, Kevin ran up to the leader to take out all his anger on him, because he abandoned them at a crucial moment. He began to insult him, saying that without his popular brother he was worth nothing. Darren approached him to cool his fire. A terrifying grin appeared on the commander's face and he began to laugh at the players. The blonde saw that there was a demon hiding behind Greg. Then he realized that he was possessed. Suddenly, Bob finds himself in a scary, dark space, and he sees his team being strangled by demonic shadows. Greg cast a fear effect on everyone using the demon's gaze, but brave Darren ran towards him without a shadow of doubt on his face. The demon stopped his attack by saying that Greg could die if he was going to hurt the demon. But Darren was not deterred and raised the dagger above him. And at the same moment, he struck Greg's armor, but it only cracked. The demon inside the boy went wild and turned to face his opponent, and there was already a blade at his eye. With one movement of his hand, the young man cut his face. The demon couldn't believe his loss, and the blonde shut his prey up in a cold tone. Memories of his conversation with his brother began to surface in Greg's mind. How he asked to avoid dangerous rifts and invited me to join his guild as an analyst. The guy simply didn't want to be a loser because even on the streets, people started talking to him only because of his brother, to congratulate him or to pass on something. Constant ridicule towards him, because he was the older brother, but had less popularity, abilities, and status. He just wanted to be someone his brother could be proud of. And that's when the demon decided to help him. In a moment of despair, a demon entered his consciousness and bound him. His body was taken under control, and he only watched from the side what was happening to his team. And at the moment when Greg's body was wounded by Darren, his soul was freed from the clutches of the demon. However, the demon was not going to give up and continued to reproach the guy for the fact that he would now kill his comrade. But it was too late. Greg himself held his body for the final attack to kill the demon. The unwavering youth made the decisive blow and looked at the demon defeated in the body of his comrade. After a while, the leader woke up surrounded by his team. Everyone started asking about his health and worrying about him. Greg didn't understand how he survived, but a calm Darren told him that he told him not to worry. Unfortunately, when checking his inventory, the blonde didn't find anything new, so the demon turned out to be useless. The next day, Greg showed his friend's post to his brother, which talked about their raid yesterday. In the comments, no one believed the tales that someone was able to defeat the demon. The brother did not express due confidence in this information. Then the guy said that he was the one who was possessed. After this sentence, the head of the Gaon Guild, a rank 11 player with a level of 368, Adrian, spilled the entire contents of the cup onto the table. During the conversation, it turned out that Greg was now ready to become an analyst in the guild, and also wanted to accept that hunter into it. It turned out that he realized his limits and realized that this was a more suitable role for him. Adrian was amazed by the capabilities of the hunter, who, in addition to destroying the demon, had a high level of mental resistance, especially since he used a dagger, not magic. He believed his brother, but he didn't understand why that guy would go into a low-level rift with such abilities. After these words, he handed over the contract with words of gratitude to his brother and now Gaon's analyst. When he saw the contract terms for the demon hunter, he broke out in a cold sweat. Meanwhile, at Max's house, Darren saw that his level had increased. Max was thrilled with the 12-point increase thanks to the demon, but for Darren it was a small thing. Coming out of the shower, Max was already thinking about rest, but he was interrupted by a blonde man who saw the mess. At that very moment, he changed his clothes and began to actively clean up. After cleaning, he made a delicious soup, and then he immediately started cleaning the kitchen and washing the dishes. At this time, Max remembered that in addition to levels and characteristics, the character settings that he set are also applied. And if we talk about talents, then we can start with magic. Because after just one demonstration, Darren can repeat any spell, he is smart, and he also has good physical potential. They were interrupted by an unexpected message from Greg. The long message spoke of an invitation to the guild, but Darren decided not to look into it and simply decline, since he didn't even have time to read it. The young man decided to start by testing his talent for magic and began looking for various videos. When the brothers saw Darren's response to their brilliant proposal, they were quite stunned. Adrian was very angry because he did not understand why he refused the offer of the best guild in Korea, which offered him a car, payment for any whims, and a share of 9.5 to 0.5. Greg suggested that they might have been beaten to it by one of the foreign guilds, the best of which were gathered in Seoul. The head of the guild did not wait and said that he himself would go looking for him to talk to him. Greg tried to describe what he looked like, but could only explain that Darren looked like a quirky aristocrat. Meanwhile, the blonde was actively studying magic and taking notes on the knowledge he gained. He understood all the fundamental principles of magic, so he believed that any spell could be cast if he had enough mana. Max was delighted. He didn't expect anything else from his character. The test was completed. Now they could distribute the points. 2 points each for strength and dexterity, 7 for mana, since it's too low. The brunette suddenly remembered the backstory of his character and decided to add one last point to his luck. It seems like he only raised his luck from 1 to 2, but in fact he doubled it. The next morning, a notification came about a class quest. After the appearance of Arcana in reality, quests began to appear very rarely. And the reason is that there are too many NPCs who can give them out. Even a regular quest is a great rarity. And here it is immediately a class quest, but a first-rank paladin has already received it. A class quest is given to only one person from the entire class. If you look at it sensibly, there is no chance that a class quest will be given to a player with level 67, but there are no demon hunters left except Darren. Akshan is the base of all demon hunters. It sounds cool, but in reality it can shock you with its appearance. Their quests are a repetition of useless work, and the living conditions and quests for players leave much to be desired. NPCs constantly yell at you, which complicates the situation. Demons penetrate the human mind, so training is needed to make it stronger. However, this is now in the past. First, Darren decided to see what the point of the quest was. At this time, in the Anti-Arcana United Building, Korean branch, to deal with the chaos and damage that resulted from the appearance of Arcana in reality, an association of former developers of the game was formed. It reacts to every update that is reflected in the real world, collecting and analyzing information for players. Some of the workers at this company were discussing whether an update would be released this week. Suddenly, their boring conversation was interrupted by an unexpected update. The entire office was in an uproar. Someone wanted to quit in a panic. Everyone was told to immediately turn off their phones, otherwise journalists would start calling. Everyone was stunned by the new update. A new demon has emerged from a new rift, the fortress, the territory, and the outskirts of the Count's family's territory, and also new monsters above level 230, Bloody Bandit, Count Joshua's soldier, his knight and servant, and others. And the most terrible thing is the new named monster Count Joshua level 430. The staff was indignant, because even the strongest player was at level 403. Reporters and journalists wrote messages in an endless stream. Colleagues thought that this was simply an impossible task, and that humanity was simply being asked to die. If the previous updates were still manageable, then this destroys the balance. Meanwhile, an exhausted Max suffered from the tireless Darren, who had completed almost all of the tasks of today's quest to strengthen the body. His whole body was shaking. The brunette did not understand how he could put so much strain on his body at once. The calm blonde was eating a sandwich while in the corner, an exhausted Max was trying to bring himself back to life. But thanks to such efforts and Darren's pride, they were able to complete all the tasks. Now the blonde could sleep peacefully with peace of mind. The next day, he went to the sports ground again to complete assignments. The quest was repeated again, so Max had a hard time again. A whole week passed and the quests were repeated again and again. Thanks to their persistence and efforts, they completed their weekly goal and received a +2 to strength and a +2 to agility. Stat-boosting items are insanely expensive, and he got 4 points without even leveling up. If this is a repeating quest that will keep popping up, then the reward justifies these terrible conditions. Suddenly, Darren heard news about the Arcana update from a nearby radio. In the evening, he watched the news, which told about a new rift, Count family territory, as well as a new monster, Count Joshua. They said that he is a demon and a vampire. His level is 430, which is the highest level of a monster at the moment. Everywhere they talk only about this news, and most guilds express their reluctance to take part in the future raid. It is associated with huge risks. Demons are the hardest for players to deal with. No matter how strong you become, you will still have to deal with the negative effects that constantly appear during the fight. Already now, many say that you need to have at least a 10-fold level advantage to defeat a demon. If it weren't for the class quest, it would still be scary because the enemy is much more powerful. However, Darren was serious. Without a drop of fear in his eyes, he declared that he would punish them. Max, although he knew that he would say this, still trembled at what was to come. The next day, Max began looking for information about the Count, and it turned out that he was in Russia. He decided that first he would need to go to the Magic Tower, since it had a portal that could take him anywhere. While the brunette was deciding what would be the most convenient and fastest way to get to the tower, Darren had already gotten dressed and was heading towards the exit to arrive at his destination as soon as possible. He took bags of his favorite tea. He never went outside without them. And he set off, ignoring Max's request to take a down jacket since it is very cold in Russia now. A large number of reporters and journalists had already gathered at the Magic Tower. Everyone was running around in confusion, waiting for the famous guild Gaon. They guessed that they would come to the tower for teleportation, since it was more convenient and logical than flying on an airplane. Of course, after a while, everyone's favorites appeared, the long-awaited guild Gaon. The guild was immediately swarmed by reporters and bombarded with questions. Adrian decided to answer the most important question honestly, saying that he did not know how to defeat Count Joshua. He stunned the journalists with his answer and continued by saying that they came here before their competitors in order to get ahead of them, and that they were not going to share information. Suddenly, members of the Shining Guild appear on the square, and all the reporters are already running towards them. All the big guilds rushed to Korea because of the Magic Tower. The brothers decided to ignore the Vitriolic Guild and began to support each other. Adrian asked about Max, but due to the update, Greg hadn't had time to contact him again yet. Meanwhile, Darren was riding the bus to the tower. This time he was watching a video about fire magic, already the 100th one. It was now clear to him that magic was activated in 3 stages: exploring the mana, interfering with it, and manifesting it. As soon as the bus driver saw that the guy was doing magic, he immediately asked him to stop, because it was dangerous. The young man didn't think it would work, but he still stopped the flames. After that, Darren wanted to check what magical skills had been added, but they did not appear. After some time, he reached the right place. The main hall of the magic tower was amazing and very crowded. The young man approached one of the portals and felt a strange feeling, as if he could understand portal magic. It even seemed to him that it was simpler than the fire magic he uses. Suddenly, some big guy from Gaon passes by and accidentally pushes the guy into the portal. The big blockhead was confused, and Adrian started yelling at him. The enraged head of Gaon wanted to fire him, but Greg noticed that the young man who was pushed looked like Max. A few minutes later, Greg began the briefing, showing a diagram of a rift in Russia, where the outer circle, the outskirts of the Count's family's territory, has hundreds of different entrances. The inner circle is the territory of the Count's family of about 30, and the central one is the fortress of the Count's family, the abode of the Count. Based on the analysis of current and past faults, if a breakthrough occurs, the Count's fortress will most likely appear in the real world. At the same time, in Russia, many reporters, streamers, and players had already gathered near the rift. Darren's portal was moved to one of the streamers. The young man began to be indignant that he was the first to find the rift. But the blonde didn't care and, in his style, asked the guy to calm down. He approached the rift of the Count family territory outskirts, which had a destruction rate of 9.7% and a suitable level for passing 240-270. In the rift, the red-haired girl, the head of the Berserker Guild, was already actively fighting with her opponents. Her comrades, who were an order of magnitude lower in level, could barely keep up with her. Her name is Lara, her level is 348, and she is in the top 100 players. Just at this time, Darren entered the outskirts of the territory. Poor Max was shivering from the cold, but the blonde didn't care. He was already ready to fight. A moment later, a pack of level 230 blood wolves began to approach him. Although he was only level 67, he was confident of his victory, so he took out his blade to attack. And in another place, another guild, desperately fighting the monsters, assessed the situation. Lara still couldn't calm down and furiously finished off her opponents. Her team, already accustomed to the leader's disposition, calmly watched the performance. Red noticed that these wolves did not feel fear in battle, and perhaps did not even know about it. Gathering together, the team heard someone's frightened howl nearby. The leader quickly rushed towards the sound, and the others hurried after her. When Darren aimed his bow, he felt mana in the arrowhead. Although the arrow is not the best, he tried to explore the mana, interfere with it, and manifest it, thanks to which it already flew all in fire. Lara, who had just arrived, was amazed by what she saw. The blonde sat calmly surrounded by corpses and fire and drank tea. The team also didn't understand what this magical skill was and what was happening. They decided that since he was acting so strangely, he was most likely a civilian who had simply gotten lost. However, he did not react to the guild leader's appeal to him, which offended the girl. Suddenly, Lara's comrades called out to her, warning her of danger. It turned out that they were being attacked again by zombie-like enemies. The players immediately realized that there were too many monsters and they couldn't handle them. This did not stop the frisky girl, and she rushed towards the creatures fully armed. Unfortunately, enemies also appeared at the top, but this time with bows and arrows. The confused guild didn't know what to do, being surrounded by so many enemies. Turning around, Lara saw that the blonde man with a cup of tea was still there and was not going to go anywhere, and an endless number of arrows were already flying at them. Darren was busy with his own affairs, studying magic. This time, he practiced with the thermos, as always going through 3 stages with mana. However, this time he had a special idea for the manifestation of mana. He thought about what would happen if the spell wasn't a skill and transformed the glass. The bright flash forced Lara to duck and close her eyes, and when she opened it, she saw that a huge wall had appeared in front of the team. A pleased Darren was finally able to use real magic. Everyone was amazed by such abilities, but no one understood who Darren was. However, a moment later, everyone felt the impending massacre. On the other hand, a horde of undead was already rushing towards them. The newly minted magician had to put aside his tea and take up the bow. One of the fighters was wounded and his comrade was looking for a healer. An enemy was chasing him and he knew he couldn't dodge, but in an instant, an arrow pierced the monster and saved the player. Darren had no plans to stop. He set the fire again and launched the fire arrow. Lara was at a loss because in front of her was a character who possessed magic and also had a bow and looked like an alchemist. After some time, all the enemies were successfully defeated. The chief was informed that there was no one else in the area, but the girl's thoughts were occupied with something else. She looked at Darren, who walked into the rift alone in a light suit and ignored her questions. The girl was so absorbed in looking that she didn't notice how he was looking back at her. Quickly turning away, she pretended as if nothing had happened. The blonde approached her anyway and sternly said that there was no extra tea for her. On the other side of the fault, a correspondent from Arkansas was broadcasting live. He told the audience that this fault, one of 3, is called the outskirts of the territories. There are hundreds of such rifts, and until they are all cleared, players will not pass the next level. There are many guilds currently engaged in the cleanup, but which one will be the first? The guild that clears the rift faster than the others will definitely gain worldwide fame. One of the assistants came into the director's tent, offering him some warming coffee. The assistant said that all guilds are about halfway through, but the shining ones are doing the fastest. The director said that in that case they should prepare near their fault to take an interview. Suddenly, an assistant rushed past the presenters as he and the director noticed something on the cameras. The director ordered the entire film crew to run after his assistant, as one of the faults had been cleared. When the young man ran to the place, he was surprised. After all, the first were the Berserk Guild, which no one expected. In the bushes, the assistant saw a Korean in a suit, which confused him, because the guild was European. Finally, the entire film crew came running to capture the first guild. The assistant decided to try to interview an unusual Korean man standing near the fault. However, Darren was not in the mood for such a conversation and asked the young man to step aside. And other reporters have already pounced on Berserk with questions. But the chief was furious, since it was that blonde guy who cleared the rift. When she was told that the young man had already left, this lady began to get even more furious, because she wanted to give the interview to him, because being the first to clean up is a great honor. Suddenly, a second rift nearby lit up blue, and the Gaon Guild emerged from there. All the journalists immediately switched to the second in line and bombarded them with questions. Lara couldn't help but say something that no one expected to hear. Everyone immediately turned around and was very surprised by this. After the cleanup, the Gaon Guild was resting in their camp. The news reported Lara's words, where she said that Gaon is not the only strong guild in Korea. Adrian and Greg themselves couldn't believe what she said about them. Greg suggested that Berserk might have met someone strong from Korea who helped them cope faster. Adrian was incredibly angry because he didn't understand who could help them so much. Meanwhile, Darren was taking a hot, relaxing shower. Max was delighted, because recently he almost died from the cold. After a shower and such a hard day, Max wanted to lie down and rest. But Darren had other plans. He again felt the urge to clean up the dust, since a lot of it had settled during their absence. Afterwards, as always, he prepared delicious food and arranged a tea party. At this time, Max decided to check the inventory replenishment, but did not find anything interesting. Although the level is now 86, the increase is small for such a difficult task. Demon Hunters are a class with benefits that don't involve skills, especially since Darren can now control magic, which takes less mana than skills. But Darren understood that he was still weak. He could not accept that if someone underestimated him, then he would prove the opposite. If he is overestimated, he becomes better and makes the overestimate a reality. The blonde decided for himself that he could not rely on magic alone, and he needed combat skills. He took Lara as an example, whom he followed during the fight because her movements attracted attention. So he set a goal to do a lot of exercises for the quest at night. He quickly finished his chores and washed the dishes. Instead of sleeping, he went for a run with the radio in his headphones. Suddenly, urgent news was announced about the clearing of 95% of the outskirts of the Count's family's territories. Although the next one should open after this, but according to information it has already reached 60% destruction. At this rate it may soon be broken through. The Gaon Guild was also in front of the TV screen when the news was announced. The time for clearing has decreased, most likely due to the presence of strong monsters there. And in the camp Arcana today, there was chaos. No one understood the reason for such a rapid increase in the monster's strength. Everyone was confused because many lives depended on this rift. Darren looked at his phone to find out more about the news, but it also said one thing. This had never happened before, so he understood why they were so confused. Vampires are creatures that share power through blood. The Count divided the power between the monsters, and after their death it began to return to him. He began to pour the returned power into the monsters of the Count's family territory, so they became stronger, and the progress of destruction accelerated. In this case, if a raid begins on the Count's territory, there is a chance that the Rift Fortress will immediately collapse. Darren did not like the Count's behavior, so he intended to kill him, since he had tarnished the honor of the nobles. Even though Max supported him, the poor guy still really wanted to sleep. But it was already late, because the blonde was heading somewhere again. Meanwhile, before the break of the Count's family territories, a young guy started his stream. He said that the degree of destruction of the rift was already 70%, and there were less than 5 hours left until the breakthrough, but many guilds had already gathered here. He went on to say that, unlike the outskirts, where there were more than 200 faults, there were only 30 in the area, and since there are fewer of them, several guilds will claim one rift, but experience and loot are distributed depending on the contribution of each. His very interesting stream was interrupted by Greg, who happened to pass behind him, which caught his attention. Greg met with his guild and shared that they still couldn't avoid competition in any case. While the streamer hid nearby, Adrian discussed with his brother which guilds had already united for battle. Suddenly, the sounds of the guild approaching interrupted their conversation. It was the 4th rank Inazuma guild, led by Leo. There was an immediate sense of unease between Adrian and Leo. They started making jokes and teasing each other. Journalists immediately rushed in, having sniffed out that 2 of the strongest but warring guilds would be heading into this rift. Greg was bombarded with shouts about the difference in ratings, that their guild was lower, but the brothers were determined. Since they had arrived first, it was not time to leave. At this time, the news was already flying about 2 long warring guilds entering the same rift. The northern rifts were left behind in 1st and 2nd place, Shining and United Skies. In the southern rift, Berserker, Second Sun, and Boheme are observed. At present, the level of destruction has reached 80%, which causes fear among people all over the world. Darren, in turn, was already drinking tea on the territory of the Count's family. In the last rift, he already realized that he could be left without mana, and this is dangerous, so he is looking for an opportunity to use it more effectively. Magic based on alchemist skills allows objects to be given any shape. He used stones from which he made a cup and a table, but the more parts, the more mana is consumed. At this time, the Count's level 300 soldiers were already heading towards him. This time, he decided to use a new technique with less mana consumption, which returns to the original state and thus defeated the enemies. And somewhere in the depths of the Count's territories, the Gown desperately defeated all opponents. But Adrian was confused by the small number of enemies. After a while, a girl came running to him with news. It turned out that she had followed Inazuma and that they were in the same situation. Suddenly, Leo and his team approached the guild, saying that it was very peaceful here. Both heads grappled again, ready to destroy each other on the spot. They were interrupted by Greg, who asked over the earpiece about the group's location. When the head said that the place looked like a square, his earpiece started to burst with screams for the guild to leave there immediately. And it was not in vain, because a moment later, level 350 knights arrived. Adrian immediately assumed a fighting stance and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. Leo turned to him, telling him to cover his back, even though neither of them liked it. But they had to do it. After a while, it became clear that the enemies were everywhere. They were surrounded. Just when everyone thought the situation was hopeless, a blue magical flame appeared. The magical power instantly swept away all high-level enemies. Both guilds did not expect such an outcome of events and were in a stupor from what happened. A huge wall appeared in front of them, and Darren came up from behind. Meanwhile, the cute streamer, who had gone to the toilet, rejoined the broadcast of the ruins. Only 12 people watched it, but he was determined. Suddenly, he saw a bright flash behind him and ran towards the light. But the heroes stood in horror all this time because the entire field was covered in stone pillars. Leo had more and more questions about this guy's origins. He didn't understand what guild he belonged to, but his thoughts were dispelled by the enemies who broke through the stone pillars. Adrian was filled with a desire to destroy the cavalry, especially since their movements were now hampered. He began to smash the knights with his strong and precise blows, but the Inazuma guild did not lag behind, grinding everyone into dust. The streamer arrived in the midst of the battle and was, to put it mildly, shocked. His stream was gaining momentum. Everyone wanted to know who this mysterious, all-powerful man was. Darren continued his epic attacks with magic, dealing with the entire cavalry single-handedly, after which he took the silver dagger, but its durability was too low. So he decided to try to interact with the dagger's mana to change its form and then restore it to its original state. When he turned the stone into a cup, the cup would gain a durability value, and when he restored it to its original state, it would return to its stone form with no durability value. And if restoration means complete restoration to its original form, then a lot of possibilities open up. And after he tried this technique on the last enemy kill and the durability remained the same, he realized that it works great. Adrian gave the order to collect the drop and praised everyone for the work done. Now Adrian was serious and really wanted to get Max into his guild, especially since Leo had also seen him in action and could intercept him for himself. Suddenly, a streamer runs up to the blonde, disturbing his tea drinking. But Max was of interest not only to him, so all the participants of the battle immediately ran up to him with questions. Adrian also approached him to shake his hand and talk, but the young man coldly asked him to get out of his way. The next day, all the news feeds were filled with photos of Darren, the young man who refused to answer questions. Now, the Shining Guild has already studied information about him. The head of this guild, Louis, the second in the player rankings, was very interested in the new character. However, his comrades, neither Meg nor Duke, knew anything about the player. The girl said that the boss doesn't have to worry about this guy because Louis can easily get him for himself. Duke was a little upset that the news was currently all about this guy, not the fact that they were the first to clear the area. After this conversation, the guys left the leader alone and went about their business. Suddenly, a young sorceress approached him, who was also interested in the news. It was Jessica, fourth in the ranking with a level of 397. She found the magic the blonde man used in battle interesting. At the same time, the Berserk Guild was also watching the news. The easily excitable Lara began to hit her comrades, saying that she had said that the guy was unusual. The girl was clearly very worried about this meeting. Leo, the head of the Inazuma Guild, wasted no time and was already calling with orders to recruit that guy to his side. The broadcast of Arcana Today began, which reported on the successful cleansing of the Count's family's territories. In the territory, the guilds Sianie and Union clashed in the fight for the first cleanup, but Sianie won without major losses. At the moment, only the Rift Count's family fortress remains. The destruction progress is currently 72%, and players from all over the world are preparing to enter it in anticipation of an increase in numbers. Given how high the stakes are, tensions are at an all-time high in the players' temporary camps. If the rift breaks, in the current situation, when Russia is practically doomed, one can only wish good luck to the players. Darren and Max have been watching the news since early morning, and at some point they started broadcasting about an unknown guy without a single magical item who was very strong. In fact, Darren couldn't wear them because he simply didn't have them. The news continued to praise the young hero, who was excellent at selecting attacks for his opponent and knew his weaknesses. Then they filmed Darren standing and calmly watching the fighting guilds, because he had already done so much. In fact, Darren had run out of mana, but fortunately no one knew about it, so Max decided to check his inventory. It turned out that he had received a rare item that you can only touch as a player, a necklace imbued with a blood curse. The so-called demon items are cursed items that can be removed from a curse, and then random effects will appear with a certain probability. But there is another option for how to use a cursed object: a sacrifice for an exorcism rite. Although the main purpose of this ritual is to kill the demon without harming the person, with the sacrifice, everything will be different. He will be able to literally invite the demon into his consciousness. This is similar to how demons put a person into an abnormal state. There is a risk of becoming possessed if spiritual powers are low, but if he manages to fight in his inner world, then he will have advantages. In the midst of active reasoning, Greg suddenly called. Max immediately thought that it was because Darren ignored the head of Gaon on the air, so he decided to write to him politely asking him not to blame him. Greg received a message with the single word problematic, which again caused misunderstanding among the brothers. The analyst began to reassure that the rift had not yet been cleared, and Adrian said he just wanted to apologize for being rude and offer better terms. The brothers only now saw how the blonde was trembling. It seemed to them that he was holding back a lot. Suddenly, everything around the boys started shaking. The Count's family fortress rift suddenly broke through at 80% resolution progress for an unknown reason. Russian authorities recommend all non-players to evacuate immediately. The death toll has exceeded 200. Adrian and Greg immediately went outside and saw something terrible. Before them appeared the enormous fortress of Count Joshua. Just then, Darren arrived at the scene. Everyone immediately started talking about the blonde guy they saw on the news, and the determined Darren calmly walked straight into the fortress all alone. He approached the statue, which seemed to him extremely disgusting, and began to criticize the fortress. The young man compared it to his huge mansion, realizing that this lousy vampire wasn't even worthy of his own. At that moment, the terrible statue came to life and looked at the player with hostility. The statue began to attack the calmly standing hero, while the others watched what was happening. With just one movement of his fingers, he instantly turned the enemy into boulders. The sounds of battle attracted the attention of the Shining Guild, which was nearby. Although the team had no plans to enter, Jessica decided to head into the fortress after hearing the familiar sounds of magic. Darren got away with it because the statue was just a stone, and he had just had a little practice on the stones, which was enough. As soon as the enemy was destroyed, all the guilds instantly began to run inside the fortress. Darren realized that by killing the gatekeeper, he had launched a signal flare for the others. The young man did not wait any longer and went to the citadel. When he entered the banquet hall and passed by the portraits of the count, he felt something disgusting. At the same time, the Gown Guild enters the fortress, and for some reason the heroes feel weak. Ever since they entered the hallway with the paintings, Adrian feels like he's being stared at all the time. It is after these words that Greg orders all the paintings to be burned, as they have a negative effect. Greg wondered why most of the players who entered first retreated. It turned out there was a trap in the castle. Statues, portraits, and interiors all evoke a status anomaly. Meanwhile, Darren walked through the hall with paintings. He was haunted by the disgustingly poorly drawn portraits. He didn't understand why there were so many useless portraits here. He felt sorry for the rock that had been broken for the sake of the unbearable statues. The fortress structures and passages are also damaged. Paths diverge unnecessarily and even block corridors. All this terribly tormented the aristocratic personality of the young man. However, at that moment, a huge staircase leading up appeared before them. Darren smelled a foul odor and knew this was the place he was looking for. Suddenly, the sorceress Jessica appears before his face, having finally found him. She began to express admiration for his magic and skills, as well as his mana, while blocking his path. In an instant, the young man stopped the flow of her heated speeches, reminding her of etiquette. At that moment, Count Joshua appeared in the doorway at the top of the stairs. In an ominous voice, he asked who dared to wake him up and notices two people. The sorceress instantly felt an unimaginable sense of pressure, and Darren addressed the vampire in an insulting format and took out the necklaces for sacrifice. He prepared to teach him a lesson so that he would no longer dare to call himself an aristocrat. He plans to begin the exorcism ritual with an offering so he can summon Joshua into his consciousness and defeat him. The count is level 430, so there is a high chance that he will become possessed. The vampire majestically said that the young man would not succeed. The demon began to take back the power he had shared with his followers. The difference between them is already over 300, but if he absorbs all the power he gave, the gap will become even greater. Suddenly, Count Joshua finds himself in a strange, dark place and freezes in surprise. But as soon as he saw the man, he released his claws. The monster began to cast a spell to destroy the pathetic worm. However, when he attacked him with fire, he thought that Darren had turned into a pile of ash. But calling out to him in another place, the young man showed that he was more alive than all the living and hinted that only the count had died there. And after these words, blood gushed from the demon's mouth, his eyes rolled back. Waking up from the illusion, the count was in a panic and did not understand what was happening because he was still on the stairs. With his magic, the blonde even blew off the roof of the fortress. Jessica couldn't help but admire Darren's skills. And now the time has come, and the guy used his skill of exorcism right. The demon received an invitation to the demon hunter ritual. He has no chance of shaking Darren's mind. The count, in the process, screams, looking into space, attacks where there is no one, or tries to run away in horror. Through the ritual, the hunter instilled fear similar to that which demons instill in people. Jessica was amazed by the young man's technique, and in the meantime they went up to the vampire to finish the ritual. It turned out that the count had suffered no damage at all. He was only overcome with horror. The blonde turned to the magician and commanded her to kill the demon, which surprised the girl. Of course, he wanted to finish him off himself, but because his level was too low, it was impossible. But he didn't tell her this, but only coldly ordered her to finish him off. The girl quickly cast a spell and a magical beam fell from the sky onto Joshua. Max was amazed by such strong magic, and Darren expressed slight surprise. As a result, their enemy turned into a handful of ashes. No matter how weakened he was, only a top player could kill a level 430 count with one blow. The young lady decided to taste her enemy, which greatly embarrassed the neat aristocrat. Without wasting any time, the guy wanted to see the changes in the tasks. However, his reading was interrupted by a crowd of guilds who were heading towards them with questions. When asked who killed the count, the players only looked at each other. Suddenly, the girl says that she will try her best to learn etiquette and introduces herself to the hunter. He sees that in front of him is a proud man who swears that he will change, so in response he says that his name is Maxim. The next day, in one apartment, the mother was cooking food and her daughter was watching the news. However, something caught her childish gaze, and she rushed to her mother to share it. When they stood together in front of the TV, they saw that the news was talking about the already famous hero Max. Mother. Meanwhile, the blonde man, as usual, was thoroughly cleaning the apartment. His routine was interrupted by numerous calls from his sisters. Max had 3 older sisters with whom he was very close since childhood. More precisely, they were among themselves, and one could say they were bullying him. After ignoring the calls, the sisters decided to come to the young man's home and were already knocking and breaking down the door. When the brother opened the door, what stood before him was the youngest, Jody, the middle one, Judy, and the eldest, Gina. And in her arms was her little daughter Izzy. Dressed in a suit, with blonde hair and perfect manners, he met the sisters and invited them into the apartment. The girls, slightly shocked by Max's new look, were speechless. At home, at this time, Greg was lying on the sofa, exhausted by the news, listening again and again about the new hero with amazing abilities. Caring Adrian brought cocoa for his brother to somehow support him. The guy was worried that with such fame, Max might not agree to join their guild. The brother reminded them that they had an advantage, his phone number, and they could call him with an official request for a gift of the trophies that they received thanks to Max. And to make sure he pays attention to them, the head is ready to go for broke and give away all the trophies. At this time, Izzy performed some kind of art on Darren's head. A kind older sister, Gina was touched by her brother's new hair color. Middle sister Judy couldn't stop laughing because the blonde guy now looked like an idol. And the youngest of the sisters, Jody, only watched in horror at the strange changes. Max was the youngest of them and was never deprived of attention. He said that he became a player, and that is why he became like this, because he assimilated with the character. Judy approached him with a question about the danger of his choice. The sisters expressed their concern about the frequent injuries that players suffered. However, he clearly and without hesitation said that being a demon hunter was his calling, and there was nothing to worry about. It was already towards evening when the sisters got ready to leave and said goodbye to Darren. Each of the sisters gave their advice, and Jody recommended saving money, after which they left. And then Max remembered that they were supposed to receive a reward for clearing the rift. The main source of income for players, paid by the Arcana developers depending on the level of the rift and the contribution to the cleanup. In fact, there are rumors that the developer of Cosmo has gone bankrupt, and the CEO is paying out of his own pocket. Max always wondered how much they paid for such tasks, 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,001. Meanwhile, in the Shining Guild, Meg kept trying to get information about Max from Jessica. The sorceress could not stand it and asked her annoying friend to move away. Meg had no choice but to leave Jessica, who was busy with something. And the magician, by the way, was just watching etiquette lessons, as she promised. At this time, Max couldn't believe his eyes, because 110 billion won had arrived in the account. The young man could not even dream of such a sum, but the aristocrat found this paltry sum unworthy. Also added to the inventory is the Vampire Count's Orb, a unique item. It is a cursed item that is usually thrown away due to the low chance of removing the curse. But demon hunters can use it as a sacrifice for exorcism. The Blood Curse necklace was chosen by Darren as a sacrifice during the fight with the Count. However, this item remained in the inventory and even the curse was lifted. Surely the exorcism cleared the curse. It turns out that the sphere necklace and 110 billion are now in Max's possession. He couldn't sleep all night. He was tormented by thoughts about where to put so much money. If he buys the items, that would be right. But on the other hand, it would be a waste of time to find the right equipment for the current level. After defeating Joshua, his level went up to 134. Just a few days ago, he was 55. So there is no point in buying expensive items for his level. The next day, a conference was held at the OAA headquarters to discuss Darren's attacks. No one understood what the young man was using because it was impossible for alchemy, since it had a limit on mana. Many argued, but one couple of colleagues were already tired of discussing Darren, who was constantly appearing on the air. They were concerned about the fact that there was no such player in the Arcana database. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to a notification about an update. The update added Usra Island, a mysterious area that was referred to as Treasure Island when Arcana was a game. Although no one has ever found this region, it is an island of fantasy where everything that was born and raised there was incomparably above the level of treasures. The news has already reported that the regular Conference of Magicians will resume this week, simultaneously with the renewal of the Usra Treasure Island. The Periodic Society of Mages, where experienced mages gather for discussion, has been of great help in improving the skills of the mages class. One of the only invited players, fourth-place finisher, Jessica enters the tower and is immediately bombarded with questions. Max was taken aback when he learned that Darren had taught manners to a person with a rating of 4. Max mentioned that there was a good chance that a regular conference could help him. Darren took this into account and decided to wash the dishes first and then head to the tower. At this time, many people had already gathered at the Tower of Magicians. Inside, In the Great Hall, Claire sat and watched the many people who had come. She was glad that the conferences had resumed. While the girl was thinking about the conference, players were frolicking nearby. One of them fell awkwardly and could have fallen right on her, but the mage was behind a hidden barrier, so the young man hit the wall, as it seemed to him. Suddenly, a sorceress passed through the magical barrier. It was Jessica, who came here by invitation because only the invited one can see this magic. Today, Claire was the guide who escorted the adventurers into the Crystal Hall. It turned out that the magician was the last of those invited, so the guide wanted to leave with her. But the sorceress asked her to stay, as she felt that someone else would come. Just at this time, Darren entered the tower. For some reason, every time he comes here, a huge crowd gathers around. However, the guy could not remain unnoticed, and he found himself in the center of attention. They surrounded him from all sides. He looked for where he could hide. And I saw that one wall felt different, so I decided to go straight into it. Indeed, his feelings did not fail him, and he walked through and came across Claire. The girl led the blonde to the conference, but there were many things that confused her along the way. She tried to find him on the guest list, but he was nowhere to be found. The girl sincerely did not understand how he was able to see the illusion, because it was set up by the Lord of the Tower himself, and no one can see it without an invitation. She explained that there was a rule that even without an invitation to the conference, anyone who could see through the illusion could enter. It's just that this is the first time she's encountered a player who saw through the illusion without an invitation. Hallucination magic that could actually be dispelled. If his spell power was equal to 1,000, he could very well use something like that. Finally, they came to a spacious hall with crystals where many invited players were sitting. When the Arcana became a reality, the Arcanians, NPCs inside the game, also appeared in reality, as well as the most important of them, the successor of the Magic Tower, called the youngest chief magician, Nicholas. The hat on the head of the sorceress Jessica continued the incredible story about the magician, but the girl was bored. Unfortunately, the sorceress was not at all interested in the story and she wanted to sleep. Nicholas spoke to all the guests about magic. He told about the appearance of a magic tower in the world of travelers. At this point, even the sorceress Jessica became interested. It turned out that he was leading to the fact that he saw the possibility of further development of magic in science. Fusion is a new type of fire that was created through magic and science. However, one must be careful when using merge, because no one knows what the variables will be when two completely different concepts are merged. That's why Nicholas needs the help of those invited for this quest. Max approached the magician with a question, stating that there was a disorder in his research. Everyone immediately started talking about how the young man shouldn't have asked such a provocative question. Such directness and harshness irritated Nicholas a little, but he wanted to know why he thought so. Then, Darren replied that magic and science were very different concepts because there was a difference in the process of merging it, so it was a mess. Previously, the blonde also experienced such a difference due to the difference between skill and magic. Nicholas was amazed that it had taken him months to create such magic, but the traveler did it so easily and experienced the same difference. And the young man continued to talk about the fact that the use of centrifugal force in the process of intervention, although the process is not complete, the results are not bad. Nicholas expressed respect for Darren and invited him to join his research. As expected, the hunter was glad he came to the conference. At this time on the paradise island of treasures Usra, the Berserker Guild was already in full force and preparing for adventure. However, they are not alone. Many guilds and streamers have already found a place for themselves on the island. Even the Lionheart Knights, a group of shadow mercenaries, and a federation of explorers arrived. This is not surprising, because this island is famous for its treasures. So many people were hooked. Suddenly, Lara receives a call on her watch from a familiar magician who says that Max himself was at the conference. He also said that the chief magician was in disarray and proved it, which earned his respect, and he gave him a quest. Meanwhile, Darren studied the writings in the hotel room with Nicholas. The chief magician directly said that he would get any items for his research that Maxim would need. With these words, he untied the young man's hands and he began to write down many expensive items he needed. After some time, on the very top floor, the five-star magicians called Nicholas to them. One of them began to talk about how he had learned that he had offered to conduct a joint research with one of the travelers. He was reminded that the magic tower does not interfere in the affairs of travelers. The chief magician broke the rules of the tower. In his defense, Nicholas said that Max definitely understood the concept of magic, and it seemed like he had also overcome the magic gap. The five-star mage continued that mages judge themselves and take responsibility for themselves, so Nicholas should be held accountable for his decision. After this conversation, he was ordered to leave the room. Leaving them, He lamented that old idiots were obsessed only with their ideals and closed their eyes to reality. His train of thought was interrupted by Claire, who was just heading to Max to hand over the requested items. Nicholas asked to give him these items right away, since he was planning to visit Max anyway. At this time, the blonde was still sitting waiting for the items, studying various books. And after some time, the chief magician came to him and laid out the requested things on the table. In front of him were unique magical instruments with amazing characteristics, but with a required level of 550. In a cold and irritated tone, Darren asked a clarifying question. Did all these items really fit under his level 134? Nicholas understood him and offered him an item related to the regeneration of magical powers. It was a 6-star brooch, one of 6 that restores 10% of expended magic power. Nicholas was impressed by the young man's knowledge of magical objects and thanked him again for his cooperation. Max was confused by the size of this object. He could not believe that it was so magnificent. Suddenly, the magician stated that at the moment they could not conduct the research, as there was a disorder in it. The quest has been changed to waiting for contact with Nicholas. Nicholas believed that with this traveler he could change the magic tower. And on the island, the same streamer who first filmed Max in battle began his broadcast. The guy started talking about the situation around him. But, unfortunately, Maxime was nowhere to be found. The young man asked the impatient spectators to wait. And in the meantime, some player approached him. It turned out to be Baxter from Supernova, who was already tired of everyone talking only about Max. Those who regained fame after the Arcana became a reality. Accidents always continued around them, who did not use any means for their own ends, especially Baxter, who was rumored to be especially evil among the suspects. The player who entered the rift with his group went missing and is rumored to have died. For some reason, he was interested in Max and asked me to tell him not to act too frivolously. After this, the player left the streamer, and a debate broke out in the comments about whether Max would come. The streamer immediately blocked the guy who wrote that he wouldn't come because he was scared. At this time, Darren was debating whether he should go to the island, but there was no point in it, nor any reason to go. Usra Island is very tempting with treasures, but the required level to get there is 350. Moreover, there are no demons in this place, but the monsters there are around 400 levels. At this rate, he would be killed as soon as he set foot on these lands. If there was even one demon there, the young man would have tried. Suddenly, a notification appeared about a new class quest, in which, in addition to body training, a task appeared to investigate the great evil on the island of Usra. The great evil is the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, anger, gluttony, lust, sloth, and greed. Max thought that since he had defeated the Count, it might not be a problem to investigate the great evil that is the 7 deadly sins. Darren said that if there was no reason to go before, there was no reason to hesitate now. So after a while, the blonde was on a hot island in his formal suit. The young man immediately felt a very strong influence on the entire island, as well as the feeling that the island itself was this evil. In this case, the connection with the natural enemy will be activated all the time, so you shouldn't lie under the enemy's feet. And behind Darren, the sticky streamer was following again. Although the young man entered boldly, he is now looking for an easy mob with whom he can fight most effectively. The young streamer warned all viewers that the broadcast would continue as long as he did not interfere with Mr. Max. Suddenly, a player ran out of the bushes, fiercely fighting someone right in front of the streamer. It turned out that in front of them was a huge emerald tiger of level 420, all sparkling, which made it impossible to aim. Darren stood behind the player to attack the enemy. Of course, Max didn't expect that the first monster would be the highest level mob on the island. He only has a 10-level difference with Count Joshua. He probably won't be able to escape, and his body shining in the sun obscures his view. However, if you immobilize him, it will no longer work. Darren decided to try using fire magic. Thanks to this AAKA, the young man's level increased and his contribution in the battle with the Emerald Tiger was recognized. The players standing nearby couldn't believe that the Emerald Tiger had just been killed with one blow. Elsewhere on the island was the guild and the leader of the Second Sun Guild, Pierce. His comrades suggested joining the detachment that had separated. According to rumors, the Shining Ones headed almost to the center of the island altogether, and their squad cannot avoid fighting the monsters. It might have been a mistake to split into groups, so now the guild will have to be reunited, since the leader realized that he had made a mistake in strategy. Suddenly, a call came from the second part of the detachment. They said their route was clear, so they would join the main group at their side. His friend said that this route was cleared by Max. Another member ran up to the master with a call from a guild member who was attending a regular conference at the Magic Tower. He revealed that Max received a quest from Nicholas and became the first player to receive a private laboratory at the top of the Magic Tower. At this moment, a happy Max was looking at the pure emerald crystal he had received. This rating item was unique, which made him very happy, but Darren tried to ignore the uncultured joy. While I was rejoicing, the blonde felt the air around him change. Suddenly, a window with a class quest opened. A notification appeared that the island of Usra is beginning to be covered in greed. The process of breaking has begun. Each of the players received such notifications. Everyone was shocked to learn that the island was a rift. From the notification window, it should be a greed demon. Any demon hunter in Akshan would know. Darren knew that if this continued, a great evil would awaken. Suddenly, one of the teams started to behave strangely. They all rushed together to search for treasure, since the Shining Ones had already broken one island and, according to rumors, received a reward. At this time, all the players on Usra Island think the same way as they do. Although in order for the treasure not to be tainted by greed, everyone must give up their desire to have it. It will be impossible to convince all the players. A brilliant idea came to Darren's mind, and he decided to collect all the treasures himself to prevent a catastrophe. On the second island of Usra, the Shining Guild also received notifications. The guys guessed that the rupture process has 10 levels, like the 10 islands of Usra, and one of them simply caught fire. The interesting thing is that it filled up as soon as they got the treasure, so it's like a bill. Meg and Duke stared at the commander in surprise as he wondered out loud if he could defeat the intimidating-looking Max. Duke suddenly smiled, scratching his beard. He himself would have fought the guy. Meg hoped that Louis was joking. The blonde tiredly ran his hand through his hair as the team began to talk amongst themselves, worried about Jessica's feelings. Someone remarked that Max had done nothing wrong. A few seconds later, Louis admitted that he had said this only out of envy, and if that was the case, then there was no point in being hostile to him. Before he could finish speaking, the information screens in front of the team turned red, blinking anxiously. The rupture process had risen to another level. The guy approached Duke, asking where exactly this happened. The man replied that in the unification of the world, there they just received the treasure. Meg shook her fiery locks, suggesting that the process had begun. Louis stretched his stiff shoulder in his heavy armor and gave the order to get ready to go. It was necessary to collect all the treasures. On the shore of the island, at the water's edge, tropical trees bent downwards from the strong wind. Max, beside himself with shock, reached out his hand to stop the restless demon hunter. He, with his entire ghostly body, clung to his leg with a death grip. No wonder, despite the threat of awakening greed, Darren swore that he would collect all the treasures. Max did not stop trusting in the prudence of his heroic double, when he suddenly stopped abruptly, looking somewhere into the distance. Directly in front of the aristocrat, blocking the way, stood a detachment of stately knights. The warriors' faces were hidden by visors. Against their background, a majestic man without a helmet stood out noticeably. The guys, seeing a lion on the flag and on the armor of the detachment, realized that these were Knights of the Order of the Lionheart. Max didn't expect that the best knights of the Empire during the Arcana era would be present on the island, and Darren, in his usual manner, boldly greeted the head of the knights. Not expecting to be addressed in such a way, Arthur was taken aback for a moment, but not a single emotion was displayed on his scarred face. The second knight immediately ordered the impudent man to behave more politely with the chief, but the man waved his hand at him and asked the traveler with interest to introduce himself. Max grimaced when he heard the pompous tone with which Darren called his name, and he added that he didn't expect to meet the Knights of the Lionheart in such a place. The chief smiled, noticing that the guy gave off a completely different atmosphere than the other travelers. Suddenly, the man stared at his new acquaintance's chest. His attention was drawn to the same legendary triangular brooch that restores 10% of expended magical power. It seemed incredible that such a young player would have it, but before Arthur could say anything, something incredibly bright was approaching from the sky right behind the young man. The next minute, the object exploded, landing on the ground next to Darren, who barely managed to jump to the side. Those present coughed from the dust and smoke rising from the ground. Lancelot asked Arthur if he was okay. Still covering his mouth with his hand, the younger knight couldn't believe his eyes as he looked at the scene that opened up before him. Previously, the warriors assumed that a meteorite had fallen on the island, but now a huge creature towered over them like a mountain, and fiery flashes fell from the sky incessantly. The giant turtle, one of the owners of the island, with a golden tusk and a rather high level of 450, was destined to become a headache for the players in the near future. The head of the detachment, without wasting time, immediately gave the order for everyone to prepare for battle. As it turns out, The monster has the ability to shoot meteorites when its eyes light up with a bright golden light with green flashes. When the knights were told to take their places, the turtle bent low and rushed to run at the uninvited guests, hissing loudly, sticking out its long tongue. Due to the size of the monster, its cry created a small hurricane that knocked down even knights in their heavy armor. Meteorites fell from the sky incessantly. They prevented anyone from seeing anything, and the warriors complained that it was impossible to approach the master. Arthur looked back at the cry of the young knight from his squad and was horrified. He called Lancelot's name with all his might, over whom hung a huge shadow from the slowly descending paw of the turtle. The man quickly rushed to the aid of his comrade in arms, ordering him to dodge. In a moment, the turtle's paw landed on the ground like a huge weight. The incredible force of the blow sent several knights from the squad flying to the side. Arthur's heart skipped a beat, but suddenly he saw something truly incredible. Darren used his mana with one hand to force the monster to raise its limb, creating a wall of solid rock between it and the humans. The knights watched him in a daze, talking among themselves. No one could understand how this traveler was fighting the owner of the island with his bare hands. The leader, without taking his eyes off the wall, lifted Lancelot, who was lying flat. And Darren sharply said that there was no time for negotiations. As if to confirm his words, there was a loud sound of breaking stone. The wall created from Darren's mana crumbled under the onslaught of the giant turtle. The commander gave the order for the knights to form a defensive line, and Max, in the shadow of the aristocrat, was losing his last bits of energy. Only thanks to the brooch was he still able to stand on his feet. Wiping the beads of sweat from his face, the boy thought gloomily that he needed to gather more energy in order to fight the Lionheart Knights later. Suddenly, he heard Arthur's voice calling out to his game double, the traveler with the magic brooch. Darren also turned around when the man asked to accept sincere gratitude for helping the knights. The leader brought his sword to his chest and offered the entire squad an oath of allegiance if Max would help them in this battle. He suddenly perked up and added that he would pay for the bus fare. This caused the player much more delight than the first offer. Darren once again gave a solemn speech about defeating the demon, promising his help. Max rolled his eyes at the sound of his accent. Meanwhile, behind the thick branches of tropical trees, the young streamer Percival was hiding, enthusiastically filming what was happening. The screen showed a close-up of the courageous, battle-hardened face of the Lionheart leader for many viewers. The streamer switched the front camera again, commenting with admiration on the oath he heard on his heart for an unknown player. Viewers in the comments asked the young man to come closer, but he refused because of the danger coming from the owner of the island. Having made sure that the knights would receive help in the person of the traveler, their leader loudly called out to his warriors. He ordered an attack in the name of honor on the huge monster that stood right in front of them with its mouth open. Skirting the calmly standing Darren, the knights helped each other on the go, telling each other that the turtle's weak points were the head and crown, and that the owner of the island needed to be hit on the legs. Lancelot, running past, cast a puzzled glance at the frozen guy. A burning irritation overcame the warrior. Yes, the player saved them from the monster's attack, but the commander swore an oath to him on his heart. And this is a reliable oath that is taken to the Emperor himself. Lancelot's green eyes glared at Darren with disdain. It seemed that the oath was an empty phrase for him. The aristocrat seemed unconcerned by anything around him. He continued to stand silently, his arms folded across his chest. At that moment, the turtle's eyes were constantly shining green, calling new meteorites onto the crowd of knights. The fearless players, shouting oaths to the order, rushed at the monster with their swords. Max looked worriedly from behind Darren, who continued to wait for something. The longer they watched the battle, the more they understood. Unfortunately, this order had poor combat skills, and now they only irritated the owner of the island with awkward attacks on his lower limbs. Max rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. Lionheart is far from weak, but what they demonstrated was completely worthless. They are clearly used to fighting at close range, with reserve troops standing behind and waiting for their turn to attack. It will take them a long time to defeat the enemy. A sign with information appeared in front of Darren, glowing red. The island of Usra is beginning to be consumed by greed. Exactly half is left before complete destruction. Max was horrified by the dynamics of finding treasures. At this rate, the guilds would get to this area too. If only he could create space to attack, things would go faster. At that moment, the turtle's eyes blazed, and she began to scatter the warriors she was tired of with her limbs. The warriors fought tensely, sensing the coming earthquake. The knights watched in horror as fiery streams of lava rose straight from the ground, burning their armor. The order scattered in different directions, trying not to fall into the deadly cracks appearing under their feet. Darren remembered something, and in the midst of the commotion that had begun, he looked closely at one person. Something was happening that reminded him of those moments in the tower when space ceased to obey earthly laws. After several agonizing seconds, he was finally able to figure out what to do. Darren called out to Arthur, who turned sharply to the guy. The aristocrat loudly asked the squad if they were ready to attack. He extended his hand, and a thick stream of magic bubbled out from it, casting a bright blue light and streams of wind around. Darren would open the way for the knights. The turtle lifted its long neck and wheezed loudly as magic began to envelop its body. The order lowered their swords, watching the swirl of magical stones, waiting for the commander's next orders. Lancelot whispered questions into the air. No one could understand what was happening now. The young streamer's phone was shaking from the owner's tension. He couldn't believe that he was filming such a solemn moment. Arthur also kept his eyes on the sky, and soon he came to understand what was happening. This traveler created with his bare hands nothing less than the ladder of the master of the magic tower. The knight second to the leader had already seen something like this, and Lancelot was convinced that an ordinary hunter was not capable of such magic. While the others were wondering about his true origins, Max was almost passing out from lack of mana. The first to set foot on the new territory was the leader of the Lionheart. He shouted that the way was open and rushed forward up the magical stones, leading the squad behind him. While the turtle, bearing its huge mouth, froze in front of the people, they could not miss such a chance. The path Darren laid out helped the knights quickly climb up and begin attacking the monster's head from all sides. A sword, tightly gripped by a man's hand, whistled through the air like a predator. Arthur raised the weapon over the turtle in one powerful movement, leaving a bright trace in the air. Max was on his last legs when a blue sign appeared in front of Darren, who was holding the ladder. Having read what was written, the aristocrat could not believe his eyes. It stated that Commander Arthur was refusing to contribute to the destruction of the giant turtle with golden fangs. Then a multitude of other signs popped up in the air. Tristan's knight refuses the deposit. The players gave up the deposit. The traveler's level gradually increased. Darren lowered his hand, having finished manipulating the mana, and the entire squad quickly approached him. Arthur told the boy that his brooch was one of the gifts that the Emperor had given to the tower in the distant past. He added that now many knights whose lives he saved are indebted to the traveler. When Darren turned around, all the members of the order, with a clatter of armor, dropped to one knee in front of him, heads down and blades raised up. Without looking up, Arthur solemnly announced that the Order of the Lionheart would remain with the owner of the brooch, Max. Even the cold aristocrat opened his mouth in surprise at this statement, and a sign about the destruction of the turtle with the highest contribution shone above him. Before the hunter could say a word, a brightly shining blue sphere with multiple symbols inside appeared between him and the knights. The members of the order straightened up and moved closer to the object. Max, peering over his double's shoulder, was delighted to learn what this sphere was: the island's treasure. For a few moments he was restless, wondering whether he should take the item for himself. But then a great evil would awaken, and if another person did it, the evil would still awaken. A danger sign appeared to the right of the guy. The process of destruction of the island due to greed continued inexorably. Staring at her, Max called out to Darren, and only then noticed that he was already holding the sphere in his hand. Max's face contorted in shock. He literally began to tear his hair out, cursing the aristocrat with all his might, because he did not think at all about the consequences. The sphere's shell began to dissipate, and a gentle voice announced that for Darren, wealth was fleeting. For him, born the heir of a great family and having experienced all the delights of wealth, the feeling of greed was unfamiliar. Steam was coming out of the ears of young streamer Percival from the realization of what kind of exclusive he was currently filming. The sphere completely dissipated and turned into a weightless, shining crown, the treasure of the island. Holding the trophy carefully, Darren said that the only way to prevent greed from swallowing the treasure was to take it without any hint of greed. How happy Max was when he realized that the aristocrat had succeeded. He danced and jumped on his head with joy. The island's jungle was becoming restless, and it wasn't the wild animals that were to blame. The events that followed the killing of the turtle were closely observed by a man with binoculars. He chuckled villainously, rolling the player's name over on his tongue, syllable by syllable. The slender stranger clutched an oblong dagger in his hands, from which drops of blood were dripping, and he defiantly whispered that he was eagerly awaiting Max to collect all the treasures. Not far from him lay a dead member of another guild. Another one in his death throes was trying to get to the blonde. He, treading heavily with wounded limbs, called out Baxter's name, calling him a miserable murderer. When the wounded warrior said that he would not let this go, his speech was interrupted by a sharp dagger cutting the unfortunate man's throat. He wheezed loudly, falling on his back as the killer loomed over him like a menacing shadow. The information board stated that Baxter had killed a player for which he had received karma points, and he had also collected 32 trophies. The man, whose half of his face was covered by a mask, clutched a blue emerald in his hands. He would definitely take away all the treasures collected by the hunter in one go. The streamer's lips trembled, and tears flowed from his eyes as the aristocrat proved that he was not greedy. He told his audience with excitement in his voice that Mr. Max had just received the island's treasure, and without even provoking the continuation of the breakup process, remaining calm, like a boa constrictor. Max looked at the crown in the aristocrat's hands, grimacing as if he had tasted a sour lemon. The sign said that this was the island's treasure, a broken crown with an epic rating. The decoration was noticeably transformed when the shine faded from it. Now it became clear that the crown was completely worn away by time, fragile and nondescript. The guy rolled his eyes, deciding that this was someone's stupid joke. Would the next treasure really be the same? A sign appeared in front of Darren about the new members of his team. Knights Max, Arthur, Tristan, Lancelot. Notably, there was a small crown next to the hunter's name, despite his low level compared to the other knights. Max stared at the screen in surprise, not understanding what kind of command this was, when Arthur decided to explain. He slapped his hand against the armor in the chest area, repeating what he had said earlier. The lion heart remains with the traveler. As usual, not a single emotion flashed across the aristocrat's face, but Max was amazed by what he heard. After all, he believed that that phrase meant the order's refusal to attack the hunter in the future. The head once again emphasized the guy's lack of greed and the fact that Max saved their lives. The man's gesture was repeated by all the other knights, who swore allegiance to the hunter. Although they did not know his purpose while on the island of Usra, they promised to be Darren's swords and shield. Max looked at the warriors, his mouth open in shock. Could it be that the best knights of the Empire followed him, ignoring the huge difference in levels? The guy laughed with delight when he saw the mobs as well. A golden sand snake, a bat made of precious stones, an emerald tiger, and a golden sand scorpion. Even the imperturbable Darren, clutching the lion's head on Arthur's armor, urged them to quickly go to the next island. Human movements caused nature to fuss anxiously in the depths of the jungle. Baxter, blending into the surroundings, invisibly followed the order, never losing sight of them. His comrade's voice came through his earpiece, telling him what he already knew. Max had taken the treasure, but the breaking process had not changed. Then asked if their guild could compete with Lionheart. Baxter called the speaker a coward, but he objected, citing caution, since the knights were not like the second son, weaker opponents. The villain's eyes lit up with a dangerous purple flame. He dreamed of the moment when the hunter would get to the pier to get to the next island, and then the Hydra's poison would spread throughout the ship. Anyone, Max? Arthur? Certain death awaits them when even a particle of poison gets into their lungs. Just as he muttered that he wanted to make sure the treasure was there before killing it, the hunter's eyes lit up with a blue light, and his gaze fixed directly on the man. Somewhere on the ghost level, his head was severed from his neck, so quickly that his hand was still clutching the binoculars. Baxter grabbed his neck in horror, frantically feeling it. Was it his imagination? Did the hunter really guess everything? There was a truly murderous atmosphere around the guy. It was felt by every cell of the body of anyone who was nearby. On a gnarled branch of a large tree sat a cute rodent, clutching a nut in its paws. As the squad led by Darren passed by, Max blossomed at the mere sight of the squirrel-like animal. Arthur grinned and whispered to himself that he thought so. Lord Max had noticed too. The man exuded the same energy, loudly drawing attention to the rat by the tree, his eyes wide and terrifying. The signs surrounded Baxter, who was clutching his throat. Arthur noticed him. His mental indicators dropped, and his status became abnormal. The man was subject to fear. Darren raised his head thoughtfully, peering into the thick branches. Max, looking up, continued to see only the harmless little animal. He fell silent, covering his mouth with his hand, surprised that such a strong man did not like rats. So terrible was his expression. Darren's attention was distracted by a sign that suddenly popped up, warning of increasing greed on the island of Usra. The process of rupture continued, now occupying 8 squares. There was only one treasure left. It was not worth being distracted by the squirrels. Darren said this out loud to the smiling head of the order. Until the rupture process filled all the squares and the discovery of the treasure did not allow the great evil to awaken, the team had to hurry. Arthur looked at the boy warmly, encouragingly saying that he would follow him. They walked on, leaving behind a rock with intricate greenery on it. Baxter's comrades tried to break through the connection to the dumbfounded Baxter, but the man seemed unable to believe that he was still alive. The player's legs were shaking. He leaned against the trunk of a large tree, blindly groping along it with his hand, while strange voices rang in his ears. Thoughts swarmed in his head like annoying flies. Why did he survive? Why did Max spare his enemy? Did he feel sorry for the man? Or did the guy decide to ignore the blonde altogether? Baxter slowly sank down onto his haunches, sliding down the tree trunk, hot tears of relief streaming from his eyes. He had definitely gone mad. He pulled off the mask from his face, on which a childishly frightened expression was frozen, and declared that he did not intend to fight anymore, causing surprise among his comrades. Baxter added that if they wanted to live, they should not pursue Max under any circumstances. Another member of Supernova, John, on the other end of the line grimaced, baring his teeth, looking at the screen of his mobile phone in bewilderment. He became extremely angry, threw the phone on the ground and began to trample it under the surprised looks of the other men. John cursed the fugitive out loud, because he insisted that Hydra venom was needed for success, so he had to take out a loan to buy it. Hearing another player try to calm him down made John even more furious. He grabbed the speaker by the collar and began to shake him, spraying saliva in his face. What does it matter to him? It's not his money anyway. Another red-haired warrior quickly broke up the budding fight, demanding that they stop being hysterical and not get angry. But the veil of rage burst out of the man like red mana. He cursed again, screeching at his comrades, asking why they were so calm. No one could understand what was going on. The other participants were even accused of colluding with Baxter, and they demanded an explanation. John, completely enraged, was ready to kill the members of Supernova, convinced that the fugitive had given them his money. Meanwhile, the Lionheart's path continued. Darren looked sharply at the sky, where dark colors were thickening, and birds, disturbed by the noise in the jungle, circled restlessly above the trees. Faithful Arthur followed the guy's gaze and asked him what was the matter. He shook his head, indicating that everything was okay. But he still found the incoming notifications suspicious, which were similar to those he had received upon arriving on the island. The entire island was engulfed in great evil. Something was wrong, and the hunter's instincts were screaming about it. It was as if an invisible demon was very close. Blinded by rage, John lunged forward, piercing the red-haired player's stomach with his dagger. The man coughed, hissing that his killer was crazy about money, but he hadn't thought it was that crazy. At that moment, the veil seemed to fall from John's eyes, and a sign about the murder of another player appeared. He cut, hacked, and pierced his comrades with a sharp dagger, asking if they had stolen his money. For the murder, he received golden fruits and trophies. Percival, his hand over his mouth, was clutching the tripod with a trembling hand, holding the phone attached to it, where the live broadcast was still going on. Without taking his hand from his mouth, he dared to look out from his hiding place to see what was happening with his own eyes. The ghostly spirit of the demon towered over John, who was grinning madly. The man only wanted to take back what had been stolen from him. The boy, beside himself with horror, ignored the screenings and started running. The murderer's bloodthirsty expression was still clearly visible before my eyes. Without looking where he was going, the streamer ran, trying to leave the terrible place, praying that the man would not notice him, because all those rumors about murders in the rifts turned out to be true. The guy understood that he would be killed if caught, and he needed to get out of this place as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the streamer's sneaker got caught on a branch, and he didn't even realize that he was about to end up face down on the hard ground. Suddenly, someone's strong hands grabbed him by the side, asking worriedly if the boy was okay. The pretty blonde man, with one deft movement, pulled the stranger to his feet, trying to find out what had happened. The streamer realized with relief that he had met the Explorers Federation, and his savior smiled and offered to sit down and rest. The boy, thinking that the killer would not be able to go against the entire federation of explorers, scratched the back of his head in confusion and thanked the player, hoping that he was now safe. A multitude of drones watching the game flew over the shore of the island, buzzing loudly. The operators, who were in their apartments, commented on what was happening. This is a view of the last island of Usra, the current broadcast of Arcana. The Usra Islands are divided into 10 islands, each with its own hidden treasure. There are many ways to get trophies, hunting monsters, island masters, solving puzzles, and much more. So, the Shining Guild has already received the island's treasure in a battle with a huge snake-like monster. The Explorers Federation was not far behind. Also obtaining the treasure, the Guild and the Federation did so in different ways. One of the drones flew to the last island with treasure, where many players and guilds had already gathered. The Shining Guild arrived and had already killed 2 monsters. It was immediately obvious that they were the ones who had taken first place in the rankings. Meg even quietly remarked how greedy their master was. The pride of Korea, Gaeon, received the treasure from the eastern island. Greg begged his battle brother over the radio not to overdo it, just to earn some points for the guild. Members of the Inazuma Guild appeared next to Gaeon. Their leader Leo was dissatisfied, since the treasure from that island went to their rivals. The drone noticed the rival guild's berserkers and second son. Pierce muttered irritably that Lara, who was being held by her sister's hands, begging her to put the knife down, was still as restless as ever. The commentator enthusiastically maintained the audience's interest, urging them to stay with them. Just as he was wondering who had received the treasure of the last island, he suddenly fell silent in shock. The federations and guilds present remained silent, their mouths open in surprise. The Duke called out to the chief, waving his hand to the side, and he replied that he himself saw everything. In the silence, the loud tread of heavy armor could be heard. Proudly carrying a banner with the image of a lion, the heroes of today's streams slowly emerged from the jungle. Probably no one could have imagined that the last treasure would end up in the hands of the Order of the Lionheart, the most powerful knights of the Empire. Even the red-haired beast Lara fell silent. Leaning forward, Pierce kept whispering that he didn't believe his eyes, while the voice from the drone was telling that Commander Arthur's level was around 600. Adrian even asked his brother if he was seeing things. Lara came to her senses and began shouting dirty curses at the winners. The commentator loudly introduced the one who headed the order. The guy looked around the crowd and straightened his tie. When he stopped, straightening up, all the knights of the temple stood in line behind him. The drone cameras focused on the guy. He was under the attention of all the players, but he looked determined, as if all the treasures of the world belonged to him. While Darren remained silent and frowned, Max's joy gradually died down under the gaze of others. He knew he would attract attention, and the commentators only made it worse by saying that Max didn't care about the big guild's opportunities. He was recognized by a player from Inazuma, from the time of the mission at the Count's estate. But Leo shushed the man, asking him not to create a conflict and to be careful. Meg, putting her hands behind her head, said that she would never fight Max in her life. She only had one life. Max clutched Darren's shoulders convulsively, begging him not to draw so much attention to himself. He began to look around, afraid that the others would notice something was wrong and would treat the guy like a fraud and even bury him alive. Suddenly, Arthur, who was standing nearby, came to life and loudly called out the name of the newly elected Sir. He turned around sharply, hearing the scream. Those present froze in horror when they saw the ground open up beneath their feet, from which liquid fire was bursting out. Lava sprayed deadly splashes onto unsuspecting members of guilds and federations. Everything happened so quickly that people, whose feet were being pulled out from under them, did not have time to escape and fell down, burning alive. Orders to turn on the fire resistance buff were heard from all sides, and the leader of the Lionheart himself was tensely peering into the distance. A monster burst out of the lava, a giant volcanic silky carp of level 420. The body parts of the island's owner consisted of magma, which hissed and transformed right on him. Lara was clutching the daggers in her hands when splashes of fire hit her legs. The girl cursed foully. The second son didn't know how to approach the carp, which was all lava. Pierce muttered in confusion that they needed to first assess the situation. While the firefish splashed in the lava, the guilds, having found themselves on different sides of the island, called for reports of damage, for those without equipment to leave, and for close combat players to change their equipment for disposable weapons. Any attacks against the island's master were useless, as the lava wall blocked any weapons. Greg, watching his brother, worriedly asked him not to overdo it as Adrian persistently moved forward, covering himself with a wide dagger. Drones were actively flying around the perimeter, trying to avoid getting caught in the burning splashes. Everyone wanted to be the first to film the battlefield. An enthusiastic commentator on one of the drones could even clearly feel the heat from the video alone, as the river of lava prevented high-ranking players from getting close to the carp. Arthur frowned and asked Sir Max if everything would be okay, and he nodded. A deep shadow crossed the man's face. To his shame, although he had promised the savior that he would become his sword, he could not now approach the enemy. The answer to his words was the aristocrat's mysterious smile. He replied firmly that Sir Arthur had nothing to worry about. Raising his palm and pointing it to the side, the hunter told his surprised partner that he had his own tricks. Louis heard this too, as soon as he noticed an unusual movement out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't believe that the guy just smiled in such a desperate situation. The head of the Shining, his eyes wide, watched Max tensely, waiting for his next move. The hunter approached the very edge of the cliff, and behind him, carefully, holding his sword in front of him, the knight stepped. Darren gathered mana around himself, shining with a soft blue color. He knew that the summoning of magic could be divided into 3 stages: summoning, intervention, and expression. At the last stage, red flashes intervened in the blue colors of mana. The carp, noticing its prey so close, pushed off with its fins, preparing to jump. The lava around the monster is not a skill, but simply a part of nature. For it, the deadly liquid is natural water. The rest of the guilds froze, completely perplexed by the player's actions. Although Max was famous for his unusual skills, no one expected what happened next. For the hunter, the lava looked like a spreading rock. With one movement of his hand, he literally lifted the entire boiling mass into the air, dividing it into clots. Both the commentators and the gown analyst froze in shock in front of the computer screens. Lewis let out a stupid laugh, staring in surprise at this strange guy. Darren waved his hand over the abyss, smiling as he admired the bright, fiery clots. Max, the only one who was monitoring the mana level, begged him to quickly go after the carp and not play with the lava. The drones maneuvered among the clots of flying lava. It was a truly incredible sight. The carp lay on the bottom, flopping pitifully, as if it were just an ordinary fish that had been left without water. The head of the Lionheart Order laughed triumphantly. Now the path to the owner of the island was paved. He, clutching the sword in his left hand, threw himself into the abyss, dreaming of making his contribution to this battle. Mesmerized by the spectacle, the leader of the Shining perked up when he saw movement to the side. He cursed, exasperated by the fact that he had been distracted for just a second, and immediately ordered his guild to load their weapons. Following the night, as if awakening from a dream, the remaining heads of the guilds rushed into battle, trying to be the first to deal with the monster. Greg, stunning Adrian, warned his brother that he had no chance of winning given the stakes of the confrontation with Arthur. All he needed was to get the first attack bonus. When the man thought that the owner of the island had fallen right into his hands, fate decreed otherwise. The carp suddenly perked up, pushed off the ground with its fins, and flew straight up into the sky. The players, having reached the bottom of the gorge, could only follow the monster with their eyes. As if in slow motion, a huge fiery carcass flew like a shadow over the heads of the troops. But the giant volcanic carp jumped up and landed back down, creating cracks in the rock. Rock chips rose high above the gorge, almost hitting a drone flying nearby. Lara, who had already fallen several times from the carp's jumps, swore loudly, not hiding her rage. The owner of the island, enraged by such an attitude towards himself, found himself on dry land and decided to fight back with just jumps, starting to do this even more actively, sweeping the guilds off their feet. Louis, who had been preparing to attack and had moved closer to the carp, slowed down. The fish was paralyzed, its entire scaly body covered with strange needles. The guy chuckled, clutching his sword tightly in his hands, and decided to get right up close to the monster. The carp's huge eye twitched, and huge spears of solidified magma protruded from the monster's body. Pierce, looking closely, reported that a change in properties was taking place. Together with Lara, they looked at Darren. The man explained that the hunter cooled the lava so that it turned into stone, just like water turns into ice. What was surprising was that such big changes were impossible given the mana limitations set by the system. When Darren said the name of his knight, he seemed to be filled with the guy's mana. His movements became precise. The warrior's hands moved as if they were mechanical. Arthur rushed forward, overtaking the other players, and in one movement pierced the carp, leaving behind a blue lightning bolt. Signs were lowered in front of the heads of all the federations and guilds, announcing the victory over the giant volcanic carp. Louis scratched his head in dismay, thinking how humiliating it was that the top-ranking Shining Ones had a 0 contribution rate. Commentators and drone operators leaned low over their laptop screens, chattering happily. The carp, studded with spears, lay motionless at the bottom of the gorge. In such a short time, the owner of the island was defeated. Darren was still standing with his arms folded across his chest at the edge of the gorge. It was he and the Lionheart Knights who had the highest contribution rate. If the aristocrat still looked relaxed, then Max, like an invisible shadow, was literally losing consciousness from a lack of mana. The player was rewarded for the high bet rate, and the blue sphere appeared in front of Darren again. Was he lucky enough to get the island's treasure for the second time? The hunter gently placed his palm on the sphere, thinking that this trophy was his last. On the other side of the screens, the men were afraid to blink, so as not to miss a single move of the winner. Behind Darren, other players crowded around, amazed that after touching the sphere, the destruction process was not displayed. After a few seconds, the sphere stopped shining so brightly, and dark clots began to gush out from it in different directions. The red plaque stated that the Usra archipelago was being taken over by greed, The process of destruction was almost complete. The Second Sun Guild were worriedly talking among themselves. Pierce suggested that the events were developing too late, and the amount of treasures did not match. Max couldn't believe that Darren felt greed when he touched it. The treasure he had just found had no effect on the course of destruction. But there was a strong demonic energy coming from somewhere. Greed must have taken possession of another treasure somewhere in the depths of the island. Streamer Percival fell on his back, covering his mouth with his hands, and the saviors crowded around him, trembling with horror. Right in front of them stood a maddened John with a sphere in his hands. He dealt with many members of the Saviors Federation. Another sign said about the murder of another player, and about the treasure received. Tears streamed down the blonde Federation's cheeks, screaming that the bastard had killed Julie. He wanted to tear the player apart with his bare hands, but he was stopped in time. John, clutching the blindingly bright sphere in his hands, blinked several times. He made a strange sound, clutching his head with one hand and closing his eyes tightly to avoid being blinded by the glow. The man seemed to wake up from a deep sleep, realizing that he did not want to do what he had already done. The player's head was splitting into pieces from unbearable pain. Suddenly, he saw his demonic double leaning over him. Something, running long claws across the man's face, asked what he meant. Greed, one of the 7 deadly sins, was looking at him. He grabbed John by the throat. He himself wanted this, and received help. Why is he refusing now? The player had a weak psyche, but the demon helped him get what he wanted, even without the necessary skill. Now it was the turn of sin itself to get what it wanted. A small human figure, wheezing loudly, stood on the threshold of death. A huge mouth with fangs as sharp as daggers was eager to devour the fallen player. In the last seconds of his measured life, he heard the sound of someone's feet and screams. A thin figure in heavy armor rushed towards John, waving his sword. The streamer, wiping away his tears, stepped back, seeing the one who appeared in front of him. Tristana, a knight from Lionheart, asked the boy how he was feeling. Percival's lips trembled slightly, hoping that they all had a fleeting chance to escape. Following Tristana, skirting the heavy branches of the trees, a man in a formal black suit appeared. Darren appeared in the clearing and immediately covered his nose with his hand, disgustedly noticing that it smelled like rotten demons. The saviors immediately straightened up, and the young streamer excitedly called the player by name. The boy sobbed and again ran his hand over his eyes, wiping away the tears. Picking up his phone from the ground, he, filled with determination, solemnly announced that the stream was starting over. Darren suddenly felt an unusual sensation in every cell of his body. He saw Tristana with a sword at the ready. The girl warned that the man at the other end of the clearing was alive and asked him to give her an order. The boys were amazed to discover that a class quest had been created because of what had happened. Sin seemed to swallow the human body, and John, or what was left of him, clenched his hands into fists, screaming hysterically. Tristana watched as the entire space was filled with a red, blood-like light. A deadly evil was brewing on the Usra archipelago. Such a wind blew that Arthur, who had just arrived, could barely stay on his feet. The island's treasure, the red sphere, rose upward, decreasing in size. John followed her, sagging like a rag doll. There was silence. Then the sphere began to tremble. The entire surface of the treasure became covered with cracks, from under which white light poured out. The man's eyes rolled back and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Shielding his eyes from the strong wind, Max barely saw on the emerging table that the island's treasures were being spoiled by greed. The class quest was finally created. Its conditions were to stop the resurrection of greed, to ensure that the island's treasures were not spoiled by greed. Status paused. Bloody streams began to gush from the depths of the earth. The island began to collapse. There was no panic among individual guilds. For example, the Shining silently watched the rift. Lara's sister, a head taller, clutched the girl's shoulder, whining in fear. Something resembling a human hand suddenly appeared from the crack. The players took a few steps back, trying to figure out what was in front of them. The shadow clung to the edges of the rift with its long fingers in order to crawl out onto the island. It was as if something had spat her out. The silhouette had already reached the shore, followed by a second hand. Pierce staggered, amazed by the strong vibration that shook the entire surface of the island. Drones flying high in the sky captured footage of the destruction that had befallen the islands. Long black threads could be seen across the entire area. The men could not believe that the islands were merging into one due to the destruction of the rift. Something appeared in the very center of the United Islands. Right from under the ground, freeing itself from the shackles of nature, the building of the Golden Palace slowly rose. Understanding flashed in Arthur's eyes. He would have recognized these vaults out of 1,000. Finally, when everything was over, the players were faced with the magnificent and majestic Golden Palace. The guild slowly, as if enchanted, walked towards the curiosity, hoping that it was another treasure of the island. Max and the aristocrat asked themselves this question, but they understood that they couldn't blindly trust everything that happened here. The landscape changed dramatically. The palace remained the same, but an evil aura hovered over it. An evil named Greed sat here. Max was sure that no one would ever want to come close to such a derogatory energy, when suddenly, a blue sign announced that the class assignment was suspended. Arthur pulled his sword from its sheath and rushed forward. Something was approaching. As he gave the order to prepare for battle, a dead man's hand burst out of the ground right at Tristana's feet. The girl screamed shrilly, warning everyone to watch their step. Disturbed by the uninvited guests, many living dead, still wearing armor, came from the depths of the earth to the surface. The commentators laughed nervously as they talked about what was happening and urged viewers to stay with them. One of them, a dark-haired man, glanced at the phone and drooped. He immediately called his friend over to share the bad news. Someone slammed the office desk hard and in irritation. Panic was brewing in the office of the anti-arcana unit. An employee was shouting that the game needed to be changed. There was a hint of hysteria in the voice. People could die if they didn't block the entrance and block off the entire island in time. An update to the Arcana appeared on players' phones. In addition to the Golden Palace, a monster has joined the quest, the Soldier Who Doesn't Keep Peace, level 500. Max stared at Darren's phone screen, his mouth hanging open in surprise. And how can the guild survive in such conditions? The class's missions were to restore peace to the soldiers, destroy greed, and not allow the island's treasures to be tainted by one of the 7 sins. Everywhere, orders were heard to evacuate those unable to fight, retreat, and run, while Darren fearlessly walked forward. The levels of the mobs and bosses were too high. Even Arthur, realizing that he would only lose people, ordered the Lionheart to retreat immediately. He heard Sir Max's commanding voice behind him calling his name. He wanted to warn the boy about the many enemies, but turning around, he froze in place, seeing the hunter's gaze. He seriously asked the man if his oath to become a sword was still valid. The knight realized that the traveler wanted to fight and warned him that their enemy was the great evil, and people's lives were in danger. Darren frowned and declared that he would punish the demons, and there were no other options. Hearing this, the leader of Lionheart looked at his comrade in shock. Then a smile blossomed on his face. The man did not feel any fear in the hunter's gaze. He regretted that the guy had not been with him in the glorious times, and Max trembled after all. He had asked for help. Lancelot and Tristana stood back to back, fighting off the dead, when suddenly they heard the thunderous voice of the commander. He raised his sword up and encouraged the team by his example. The man wanted Lionheart to keep the oath of their hearts so that Sir Max could get to the great evil. The knights immediately lined up in neat rows, loudly chanting the name of their order. Percival, kneeling on one knee, filmed the proceedings and watched the players with admiration. The Golden Palace, shrouded in the energy of evil, shone somewhere in the distance. It still needed to be reached. The entire slow path was blocked by a horde of the living dead, the island's warriors, who had once also selflessly defended their territory. Darren took a deep breath and loudly ordered the order to attack. In the office of the anti-arcana unit, a dark-haired man was showing his colleague a video of the attack. He couldn't believe that the players had decided to do such a thing. Hadn't they seen the update message? Drone operators are glued to the screen. The Knights of the Lionheart Order and the player Max together attack the soldiers of the living dead, trying to besiege the Golden Palace. This event was broadcast across the planet on the televisions of ordinary people, and various experts were invited to express their opinions. School children ran away from classes to discuss Arcana while watching streams. Needless to say, the battle could be watched by all passers-by on huge screens right on the street. Meanwhile, there were alarming statements that the island should be isolated. Max nervously tapped his finger on his chin. As expected, the Knights of the Lionheart held up well, and of course they were the best knights on the continent who had no equal in close combat. Their attack helped Darren buy time to restore his own mana. He thought that if things continued like this, he would still have time to take part in the battle, and he did not notice how the already defeated dead were coming to life behind him. The leader of the Second Sun Guild was closely watching the knights battle on his mobile phone screen, and when another player called out to him, calling him to join the battle, he shook his head. No guild will participate in this suicide, it is too reckless. Pierce was confident that the Lionheart would fail miserably and retreat. Max looked around and noticed with horror that the fallen dead began to rise again and slowly move towards the players. Darren had a sword in his hand, but his mana had still not fully recovered. Far beyond the horizon, a bright beam appeared, blinding the players for a second. He rushed past some of the second Sun members, his hair tousled by the strong gust of wind. The men turned around in bewilderment, following him with their eyes. The beam continued past Max and Darren. Adrian from the Gan Guild arrived to help the knights and make his contribution, cutting down the dead with a fiery stream of his sword. The strong player tirelessly cut off the heads of even the strongest-looking warriors. He was distracted for a moment, noticing the small girlish figure of the head of the berserkers very close. The girl who fought selflessly was also surprised by Adrian's presence. Drones filmed the movements of two guilds, unexpected reinforcements for Lionheart. Having cleared a path for himself, Adrian saw Darren barely standing on his feet. Max behind him was in much worse shape. Lara, in her usual manner, immediately pounced on the guy, screaming. Max, clutching the aristocrat's shoulder, beamed. Had other players really come to their aid? Darren paused, then suddenly commanded them to help him, causing Max to cry out in horror at such ignorance. The guild members surrounded the hunter, and there was an awkward pause. Lara, who had a debt from the previous rift, came to help. But upon hearing the order, she slowly began to seethe with anger. Greg coached his brother, pointing out that this was a great opportunity to prove himself to Darren once again. However, the guild leaders did not seem too enthusiastic about this appeal. While Darren lazily scratched his ear, Max almost cried. The players themselves offered to help, and the guys only made them angry. At this time, behind Darren and the knights, groaning and wheezing were heard, the dead warriors rose again. Lancelot was the first to notice this, warning everyone by grabbing his sword. The players began to fight back furiously. The dead took them by surprise, and orders were immediately given to the priests, who needed to be given the blessing of holiness and protection. Max trembled. He had no mana left for support. Darren touched Lara on the shoulder, saying that the Knights of the Lionheart also needed blessing and protection. He, adding that he didn't even have tea for someone like her, demanded buffs from the girl. Lancelot looked up and saw something that gave him strength. An angel of incredible beauty descended from the heavens, radiating divine light. Priests from the Gaon arrived to help the order for support. The defense increased, the combat ability against the undead increased sharply. The leader of the berserkers stamped her foot, saying that this was a cheap trick. She was the one who wanted to help first. The Knights of the Order immediately felt a surge of strength. Now they would be able to destroy the dead. Darren told Adrian that he would not forget this act, and he, extremely happy, waved his hand, killing another rebel. The man smiled unctuously, offering the hunter personal buffs. A blessing for holiness, protection, in general, whatever Darren wished, the priests of Gaon would fulfill. Darren, without thinking, blurted out that he did not believe in God and did not need anything. Adrian froze in shock, staring at the hunter in surprise. Max immediately covered his game double's mouth with his hand, ordering him to shut up. Arthur stopped, watching him. The man was breathing heavily and heard someone call his name. This voice pierced his brain with sharp needles, causing the knight to convulsively grab his head. He opened his eyes, which had been closed in pain. In front of the Lionheart leader stood a silhouette made of only light, saying that there was no more faith in God. Light filled the entire iris of the man's eyes. His Majesty had arrived. The doors of the palace turned red. Something was seething and shaking inside. Bloody flashes gushed out. They reached straight towards the knight, completely enveloping him. While no one understood what was happening yet, Darren and Adrian, who were standing closest, stared at Arthur in surprise. The Lionheart's leader didn't dare to close his eyes, and the dark red snakes narrowed and penetrated straight there. While they were sending their poisonous miasma into the darkened pupils, the man whispered what he had promised the Emperor. The golden, elaborately crafted doors closed behind the knight with a bang. He dropped to one knee before his master, reporting that a demon legate had appeared in the northwestern canyon. A young man with long blonde hair sat on the throne, crossing his legs, and listened to Arthur, who promised to leave immediately on his orders alone. There was a silence. The ruler moved his graceful fingers in a thin glove. He rose slowly and gracefully from the throne, walking past Arthur. He turned to watch the overlord, who concluded that thousands of soldiers would once again fall at the hands of demons. The man stopped at a large window, saying that demons had appeared and the adventurers had disappeared. The magic tower that was investigating them instantly disappeared right under the eyes of many townspeople. The worst thing is that a huge part of the Empire's territories and its subjects disappeared without a trace. Every night the inhabitants asked God if this world had really come to an end, if this was really his will. The ruler, lowering his head, whispered that God had never answered him. And even the red moon, bashfully hiding behind the clouds, could not answer the question whether God had disappeared too. Turning around, the handsome blonde asked his knight to share his own thoughts. The man swallowed hard, answering that demons were blocking God's path to people. Arthur rose to his feet abruptly, vowing that the servant of the Lord would return after defeating the legate of demons and would surely open the way to God for his majesty. The Lord did not answer, looking carefully at the knight. Then he shocked Arthur with a confession. Everything was fine. Now he himself no longer believed it. A smile blossomed on the lips of the young ruler. He said that he would only believe in the return of his knight. Arthur nodded, smiling back. As promised, the man brought his best warriors onto the battlefield. They fought selflessly against the most powerful and terrifying creatures from the underworld. It was in this fight that the man received his terrible scar on the bridge of his nose, but at that moment he did not even pay attention to it. He encouraged the soldiers, calling on them not to surrender, as his majesty was expecting victory. Right during the battle with another demon, Arthur noticed him. The demon legate is unlike the others. With bright eyes, smooth purple skin, and despite his demonic origins, a beautiful face. Abandoning everything, the knight ran to the legate, intending to get rid of the spawn of hell here and now. The demon looked at the man with a contemptuous gaze, holding onto the reins. A slight smile touched the creature's lips. Alas, it was too late. Arthur frowned and turned around in bewilderment. His outstretched hand came across an energy barrier, a thin wall of blue color. Something strange was happening to the knights on the battlefield as well. Mana passed through their bodies, causing the warriors to tremble and retreat. Arthur froze, unable to move. He couldn't believe what was happening. The legate rider turned into a dark silhouette, dissolving into the air before his outstretched palm. The next moment, instead of the demon, people were looking at the knights, filming them on their smartphones. Sprinkled with the blood of their enemies, the knights found themselves in the city square, frozen in combat poses. The flashes of the cameras were blinding. The human hum grew louder. The man did not understand where he was. The crowd talked among themselves in bewilderment, recognizing the strangely dressed aliens as Arcanians. But it didn't matter at all to the knights. They had to return. Return to the battlefield to win victory for his majesty. Arthur returned to the island, kneeling before the silhouette. His beautiful master, the features of a painfully familiar face, gradually appeared in the air. The man trembled. The corners of his lips turned down, and he raised his tightly gloved hand. The guilds and orders continued to watch, realizing that what was happening did not bode well. They were amazed to hear Arthur asking the Lord for forgiveness for his incompetence and for being late. A demonic silhouette appeared above the man. He straightened up and seemed to no longer have control of his own mind. The knight loudly announced that he would become his majesty's sword and destroy all enemies. Max leaned forward in shock, whispering the knight's name as demonic energy began to surround him as well. Arthur turned and walked slowly towards his former allies. It was them that the powers above ordered him to choose as his enemies. Having lost all humanity, the knight, led by a demon, prepared for a bloody battle. Lancelot and Tristana, afraid to approach the commander, cautiously asked if everything was okay with him. Surprised, Lara tried to be rude to the leader, but the knight stopped her in time. Max began to bite his nails from the tension. How unlucky they were that Arthur, of all of them, became possessed. It was probably some kind of debuff. Mind control can be more difficult than possession from time to time. The place in front of the palace gates, where a man had stood a second ago, suddenly became empty. A flash of bright red light flashed somewhere in the distance, and Arthur, his eyes shining with demonic force, raised his sword. Darren felt his energy right behind his back, and at first he stood there dumbfounded, not expecting something like this. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a sharp movement from the other side. It was none other than the head of the gown. The man, flashing a toothy smile, winked at the hunter, assuring him that he was now safe. Adrian didn't think that the answer he would receive would be a look of hatred from his beloved Max. The red-haired warrior stepped back. Greg's voice in the earpiece scolded him. He shouldn't have interfered in the affairs of Max's comrade. Now he was clearly disappointed. Max's vision was double as he recuperated, and in the back of his mind he knew that Darren had hurt Adrian, who was just trying to help. Finally, he shook his head. His mana had almost recovered, and the head of the gown had greatly helped with this. Meanwhile, Arthur's own knight, Lancelot, clashed swords with his own. He begged the commander to come to his senses while he persistently tried to stab the innocent player with a weapon. The entire detachment must return to his majesty in full force. The man froze for a moment, but then his eyes filled with demonic malice again, and Arthur spat out an order to be silent through his teeth. He stunned his troop by calling them filthy demons who dared to mention his majesty. The demon controlled the man, making them believe that the commander had betrayed them, turned away from his brotherhood. The man bared his teeth and furiously attacked Tristana and Lancelot, loudly blurting out that he no longer wanted to listen to them. Max looked at the sky where Arthur, possessed by the demon, was moving chaotically, noticing that same glow again. The knight's cloak fluttered. The sword in his strong hands was pointed straight at his comrades. Lancelot had no choice but to defend himself and the rest of the squad. The man warned the others that the crazed leader was heading for the front. He rushed past the players like a whirlwind, sweeping away everything in his path like a hurricane. The demon lifted the man into the sky and again ordered him to attack. Arthur, baring his teeth, picked up speed to come down with another blow. The devilish power exceeded the ability of an ordinary knight, and a huge dent was formed in the ground. Adrian held onto his sword with all his might as the other players were swept off their feet by more and more attacks. The knight kept throwing his sword at him and at Lara, who stood in his way. Although they tried to fight back, even when they gathered in a group, the guild leaders felt the superiority of the Lionheart leader. The man jumped back and raised his sword, burning with hellish flames above himself. Using this maneuver, he slammed his weapon into the ground with all his might. A fiery tornado swept from the very gates to the place where the players were, creating deep dents in the ground. There was an explosion. The battlefield was covered in smoke, and numerous drones were unable to film what was happening. Lara's sister ran up to her, coughing violently. The girl fell, but waved off help, saying that she had tripped. Someone's wheezing was heard. A player who was buried under stones asked for help. Tristana saw other knights running to her and asked them to help the wounded. A bloodied Adrian leaned tiredly on his sword. Calling Arthur a disaster, he told his worried brother that he was fine. Blood was streaming down the man's face from a cut forehead. He removed his hand from his face, seeing something incredible. The other players, sensing the hesitation, also turned their heads in that direction. The wounded Lancelot rose up on his elbows in shock. Percival, who had not stopped filming, sat down heavily on the branch of a tree under which the entire Federation of Saviors had gathered. The hunter approached the bewitched knight and directed his palm at him with authority. The man stopped, holding his bloody sword up, and did not move. The knights couldn't believe what they saw. Max stopped the commander with one gesture. Max rolled his eyes. He didn't see what was happening to his double. Darren's eyes lit up with an inner strength, and he adopted a "don't hit me" attitude. Arthur stared at the guy, looking at him in surprise. Max himself did not expect that his maneuver would have such an effect on the demon inside the knight. The aristocrat, without giving up, returned to his usual state. The Lionheart leader saw only one hunter clearly among this blurry horde of demons. Darren's voice in his head replied that he didn't know anything about it. Maybe it was because the guy was a demon hunter. This was one of the effects of the skill exorcism. Arthur cautiously asked the traveler to identify himself. Otherwise, he would have to strike him down. Max's thoughts were racing. He understood that he would die if he remained silent, and he could only curse out loud. The aristocrat blinked his eyes in bewilderment as the knight continued to glare at him. Max was tearing his hair out behind Darren as Arthur asked him if he was silent or couldn't answer. Finally, the knight's empty gaze passed over the hunter, concluding that nothing would matter anymore once he killed the man in front of him. Darren protested loudly and lowered his palm. He asked to wait and extended his hand as if to shake hands. The knight frowned, thinking that the hunter wanted to deceive him. But the clear figure did not attack. It merely changed the position of its hand. The red light disappeared from Arthur's eyes as he looked more closely, his gaze clearing. That same brooch, on the stranger's chest, brought back memories just by looking at it. The brooch was presented by His Majesty to the tower. The entire squad of knights bowed before the player who saved their lives. The Order of the Lionheart swore allegiance to the owner of the brooch, Max. After all, he himself swore that he would become the young man's sword. The warrior's hands trembled, and he opened his eyes wide and whispered the hunter's name. Darren didn't react in any way, while Max looked dumbfoundedly over his shoulder, hoping that the drugged man had remembered everything. As expected, true sincerity worked. Max is a friend, and he is unarmed. The guy exhaled tiredly, clutching his cheeks with his palms. Darren glanced down at the blue sign that had appeared. The level of the exorcism skill has increased, and even some new effects have been added. Feeling danger behind his head, Arthur turned around abruptly. He screamed, warning Max of the danger. He himself, turning around, heard someone's demonic laughter. His gaze clouded with incredibly powerful magic, furious, saturated with hatred. The space of the island disappeared. Right in the middle of the void, filled with dark light, a man sat on the throne, his hands on his knees. Max assumed that he had entered the mind of this stranger, but everything around him screamed that this man was the embodiment of evil. The man on the throne, handsome and young, wearing outlandish clothes with massive gold jewelry, muttered sadly that he simply wanted to protect his kingdom. Max almost fell over from the noticeable shaking when the man added that he was only worried about his precious kingdom of Usra. Once upon a time, the island was a land and sea full of abundance, filled with sparkling gems and people who loved each other in peace and happiness. But one day a stranger washed up on the beach. The people of the kingdom and the king himself took care of him and treated him with the utmost respect. And then, having gifted him with riches, they sent him away. The price for this was a brutal invasion of the island by outsiders. The locals were brutally killed and robbed. Those people who had never fought before were unable to fight back. The kingdom was trampled, enslaved, and the king himself was overthrown by the one who had once been given a sincere welcome. The young ruler looked into the eyes of his tormentor, asking why he did this when they could have divided the island's wealth between them. The invader laughed in the young man's face. Why would he divide the gold and emeralds? Kneeling in his hall like a foreign slave, the king did not know what to do if absolutely everything was taken from him. The crown that fell from his head rolled to the side, grabbing his long hair. The ruler screamed shrilly. And now, having turned into a demon who wanted revenge more than anything in the world, he stretched out his clawed hands towards the stranger's neck. His eyes, drowned in rage, burned into someone else's insides. The man screamed that he would not give up to anyone what belonged to him. This island, this sea, this sky. The hunter remained silent, not taking his eyes off the maddened ruler. All these people who killed the owners of the islands to get the treasures, they all belonged to only one ruler. Suddenly, Darren shouted, ordering the man to be silent. He kept talking about some trifles. He no longer had the strength to listen to it. The king's face smoothed out. Even the demonic features half disappeared. He did not expect such a rebuff. Pressing his hand to his heart, Darren firmly replied that all wealth was fleeting, and he would teach a man to feel only pride in his heart as soon as he closed his eyes. The demon's eyes sparkled again. He bared his teeth, not understanding what this stranger wanted to convey to him. The player's eyes widened and his mind returned to the island. A worried Arthur immediately ran up to him, thinking that Max had been possessed by a demon. Without saying a single word, the boy extended his hand, intending to direct mana to the lock. He frowned and focused on his own magic, about to intervene, just a little. The stone, under the influence of mana, began to tremble slightly, and its surface became covered with cracks. The huge columns that supported the high vaults gradually collapsed. The Savior Federation and Percival watched the destruction of the majestic palace with desperate cries. The same reaction was felt by those who followed the events using drones. Those present as one clutched their heads. The castle was collapsing before their eyes. Duke and Jessica, discussing their business, looked indifferently at Lewis, who was surprised by the broadcast, and he admiringly called the hunter a monster. Within minutes, the Golden Palace was completely destroyed. Darren loudly called Greed to come out. Max behind him could barely stand on his feet. His mana was running out more and more with each passing second. The aristocrat shouted that wealth was worthless, and that the soldiers who had sacrificed themselves for the defense now lay in ruins. And despite the fact that the ruler has now turned into a demon, he was once a true monarch. A huge devilish pillar with many eyes and an open mouth like a snake burst out of the rubble, cursing loudly. How dare the impudent man touch his wealth, and even resist greed, one of the 7 deadly sins? The poor little man, Darren, stood with his arms folded across his chest and looked at the monster looming over him. Greed immobilized the heads of the federations, threatening to devour both the hunter and his troops. Lara was suffocating. She couldn't move, panicking and gasping for air. Hundreds of eyes of greed looked upon the players, vowing to turn them into undead creatures who would forever protect their treasures. Adrian, frozen motionless, trembled. Better death than such a fate. When it was announced that judgment was clouded by intolerable desires, Darren loudly commanded sin to know its limits. At that moment, the knights felt that they had regained the ability to move. Lancelot and Tristana lowered their heads in shock, slowly moving their frozen fingers in the air. The rest of the guild members looked at the hunter carefully, waiting to see what would happen next. The aristocrat looked at Greed just as fearlessly. A huge mouth with many teeth snapped, trying to reach the guy. The demon screamed that an ordinary person would not dare to control the mind of the great evil, the strongest sin. Darren countered. What stood before him was neither evil nor greed. The blue sign announced the activation of the exorcism ritual, and it became possible to invite the demon to take part in the ritual. A shining ball appeared in the hunter's hand. The guy screamed, calling on the last king of the Usra kingdom to come to his senses. The monster stared at the man in shock, his mouth wide open. Darren announced that it was time to correct his mistakes. The sphere in his hand broke into pieces, emitting a soft blue light. Greed laughed at first, He would simply dodge such a worthless attack. But the next moment, the huge eyes began to blur right into the air. The handsome face of the ruler of Usra appeared in the hunter's mind. The man decided to stop because his castle had already fallen. The light from the sphere absorbed the demon, dissolving it within itself, drowning out its dying cries. The small human figure continued to stand bravely in the midst of events. Percival, holding his mobile phone tightly in his hand, almost fell off the branch from what he saw. The drone operators were going crazy with raging emotions as the events unfolded. The head of the second son also watched the broadcast with his mouth open. All that was left of the demon was smoke, which gradually swirled around the hunter. He did it! Max's amazing achievements are constantly updated. And only then did the audience notice an unfamiliar man appearing from under the remains of the great evil. In front of the hunter, kneeling on one knee, sat the barely alive king of Usra. Eyes swollen from tears opened, the man stared at his hand, certain that he had died along with evil. He began to tearfully thank the hunter, but Darren didn't even hear the master. Signs about leveling up flashed before his eyes. The aristocrat stared in shock at the last one, which stated a hidden task. There were 9 seconds left to complete it. Hidden task. The king, who tried to kill the great evil together with the player, could no longer find the meaning of life. It was necessary to help him with this. To transfer the crown to the king of the kingdom of Usra, both boys stared at the sign that had appeared, which depicted something they were already familiar with. That same broken crown, the first treasure Darren received. The hunter slowly approached the shining sphere in front of which the Lionheart Order had gathered. The drone commentator was enticing the audience, not knowing who appeared at the site of the great evil's fall, his body, or a new evil. And now all the spectators watched tensely as the player Max took something out of his inventory. Darren handed the man on his knees what belonged to him. The crown slowly fell on the king's head, and he felt as if he had regained his body and soul. Max breathed a sigh of relief, remembering how he had mistaken the jewel for trash. Now the task was completed. An intricate golden plaque appeared in front of Darren in a haze of bright light. Exactly the same ones appeared before the players of each guild. Someone revealed the secret of the island of Usra. The head of the Eastern Guild began to look around excitedly, trying to figure out who had cleared the rift. Lewis let out a nervous laugh. He knew exactly who this someone was. Percival screamed like a girl, filming everything on camera, his viewers tearing up the comments section. It turned out that this notification had spread throughout the world. Every resident and every player around the world received it. The blue light was blinding. Max closed his eyes. Could it have been him who did this? The tablets solemnly stated that the new kingdom of Usra was ready to come into being. From the depths of the green jungle, a bright blue light shot into the sky. Strong walls began to appear behind the players. Absorbing the trees, a new golden palace was erected in their place. Arthur and Lancelot looked at the unusual phenomenon in fascination, quietly talking to each other. A few minutes later, the entire ancient kingdom of Usra stood on the island, and a golden tablet read, "A new region had been discovered." The game transported the drone operators to the island, who looked around in amazement until one of them realized that he needed to quickly capture the stranger's face. The players stood in front of the palace gates with Darren at the head. Max and the aristocrat looked at the king of the island. It was radically transformed, returning to its former majestic appearance. The man dropped to one knee again and introduced himself, the last king of the kingdom of Usra, Merlin. The game has awarded Max the honorary title of Benefactor of the Kingdom of Usra. Relations and influence on the kingdom have reached their maximum, and the authority function in the kingdom has also been activated. Merlin thanked the benefactor of the king and his kingdom. Laura's sister, looking at the man with admiration, even thought out loud about seducing him. The head of the berserkers rolled her eyes upon hearing this. Percival received more and more comments from amazed viewers. Max's face turned into one big letter O from what he saw. He trembled, hiding behind Darren's back, as the king, pressing his hand to his chest, asked the name of his savior. The player tried to relax. Even the fallen king of the ancient kingdom remains its ruler. He only hoped that the aristocrat would be polite, but he simply blurted out the name without any frills. The guild leaders were shocked by such rudeness. Merlin smiled kindly, promising that he would remember the name of his benefactor for many generations to come. The leaders were amazed again, but this time by the king's politeness. As Merlin stood up, he remembered that while under the influence of the great evil, he had heard important words. The man repeated Darren's words that it was time to correct his mistakes. Max grabbed his head. It sounded so pathetic. Looking back, Merlin told how he wanted to commit suicide after that, along with the great evil. But then his benefactor saved his life and gave him a crown. Arthur was dumbfounded. For a moment it seemed to him that the silhouette of his ruler appeared behind Merlin. The man lowered his head, wondering what he should do. A king who had lost all his subjects because of his own mistakes. Darren remained silent, not knowing yet how to console the king. Now that the kingdom had returned to the island, the jungle was no longer so lonely. In the jungle, skirting the trees, the head of the second son was racing. His team could not keep up with the man, but he ordered them not to whine and to hurry. He shouted enthusiastically that this was the first update of the world-class Arcana. A new country had appeared, and one had to smell the gold of Usra. Back in the days of Arcana, one country was incredibly valuable. This land would have cities, villages, and an incredible amount of rare monsters, hidden treasures, and resources. But once the kingdom is rebuilt, everything will become more expensive, and you need to hurry to take advantage of every opportunity. Meanwhile, Merlin stood thoughtfully in front of the palace, thinking about the future. Darren watched the king, searching for the right words. When he spoke, the man turned around with interest, looking closely at the guy. Those present were surprised to hear that he was proposing to restore the kingdom of Usra. Merlin's face showed genuine surprise. He didn't think that this was even possible. But the ruler's gaze fell again when he asked who would trust a king who had turned his back on his people and follow him.